Joffrey Baratheon had never felt a day pass so slowly. The morning of his wedding to Margaery Tyrell dawned bright and golden over King's Landing, as though the rising sun itself had been burnished by the Lannisters' own gold. Yet behind the brightness lay a sense of apprehension that twisted in his stomach. He had never truly been nervous a day in his life. Anger, yes. Cruelty, yes. The raw energy that came with being a prince, secondhand fear that he channeled into bullying. But not this. He found himself pacing in his bedchamber, the grand bedposts carved into lions' heads observing him in silent disapproval. Servants bowed and curtsied, but he hardly noticed them. His mind was too full of questions, for the first time in his short life, about who he should become on this day. Until now, he had cared only about who he was, and that had always seemed enough. Joffrey, the king, the true ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, the terror of court, the boy who believed he could do as he pleased. But wedding days, by their very nature, change men, even cruel boys who sit on a throne of swords. He dressed in Lannister red, with gold trim shimmering at the edges of his tunic. A tall mirror, polished to perfection by nervous handmaids, reflected back a young man with hair the color of pale straw, features pinched, and eyes that flickered with an uncertain glint. How different the world seemed now that his betrothed waited for him at the Great September, her family newly arrived from Highgarden. Margaery Tyrell had dazzled King's Landing from the moment she set foot in it, her gentle grace and clever, unassuming wit enthralling the common folk. He had initially chosen her, at his mother's urging, because it was politically advantageous. He'd sent Sansa Stark away from his side and had taken up the Tyrell match with no more than a brief, casual thought of the future. But Margaery had taken hold of the city and, bit by bit, she had chipped at something within him. He began to feel a deep, gnawing desire to appear worthy of her admiration. Perhaps that was what caused the restless feeling that morning, an awareness that he might want to be a better king than he had ever bothered to be before. He made the familiar walk to the Great September of Baelor, though on this day it felt like a journey across a continent. The gold cloaks stood in neat rows along the winding streets, an honor guard to protect the king from any hidden threat. But Joffrey noticed how ordinary folk pressed forward to see him, to see Margaery. He saw the expressions in their faces: hope, curiosity, some lingering terror from what they had heard of the boy king's cruelties, but not all were cowering. A few cheered as the royal procession passed, believing in the promise of House Tyrell's generosity. The crown he wore, the heavy circlet of gold with rubies shaped into lions' heads, weighed down on his brow, and in a sudden moment he thought how strange it felt to be so simultaneously powerful and fragile. He kept his head high. From the corner of his eye, he spotted a young girl in the crowd stretching out her hand as if to touch him. She was half his age, clad in rags, but the hunger in her eyes was painfully human. He had never truly paid attention to such things before. That flicker of compassion surprised him. He almost motioned for the guards to let her approach, but the press of the crowd prevented it and she vanished behind taller men. The day moved on like a dream as he continued, wishing for the first time he had the presence of mind to do something kind. Inside the Great September, the air was perfumed with incense that wafted upward, curling around the pillars. Flower petals were strewn along the aisle where Margaery would walk, a subtle nod to her house. The stained glass images of the seven seemed to glow from within, colored sunlight bathing the entire space in jeweled brilliance. Margaery arrived a short while later, an apparition of grace. Her gown was a marvel, cream silk embroidered with delicate green leaves and golden roses that entwined around her bodice. When she met his gaze, she smiled in that gentle, knowing way that made him feel, just for a moment, that he might be good if only he truly tried. He offered his arm to her. Together they advanced toward the High Septon. The murmuring watchers parted into two sides, Lannisters and Tyrells, plus the many lords of the realm who had come to witness this union of powerful houses. He repeated his vows, stumbling only once, but Margaery squeezed his hand reassuringly. The hush fell heavy as a temple bell as the Septon asked them for the final words. Margaery promised her loyalty, her devotion, her vow to stand by his side as queen. When the turn came for Joffrey, he felt his hands clammy, his throat tight. He had never had to speak words of love in such a public display, never felt the sting of needing to be genuine in front of anyone. But the vow left him surprisingly earnest. I shall protect you, honor you, and fulfill all duties as your husband for the good of the realm. The words came out calm and strong. He felt the eyes of his mother, Cersei, on his back. Somewhere to his side, he imagined the stoic face of his grandfather, Tywin Lannister, proud but watchful, ready to judge. Margaery's eyes shone like polished emeralds, and a sweet, relieved warmth spread through him. When the ceremony concluded and they were declared man and wife, the applause rose like thunder in the cavernous September. The city erupted in celebration. Knights clapped their gauntlets against their breastplates, ladies dabbed tears of joy from their eyes, and in the street, bells rang out in bright, echoing peals. Joffrey led Margaery outside to greet the crowd, his new wife's hand in his. Standing at the apex of the marble steps, he lifted their joined hands high. He waited for the cheers, and they came. Cheers for the queen, even more than for him, but he felt a stirring in his heart that he had never before recognized. He wanted to do something truly noble right then, something that might win him the love of the people. Instead, he merely smiled and gave a short speech, not trusting himself to say much. His voice still carried authority, but lacked the cruel edge he usually used to assert himself. And for a moment, King's Landing believed in the union as a source of hope. The wedding feast followed at the Red Keep, and it was grander than anything the city had seen since the end of Robert's rebellion. Tables groaned under the weight of succulent meats, spiced wine, candied fruits, fresh bread, and honey. Minstrels wandered between rows of diners, playing soft music while jugglers entertained at the periphery. Great lords from every corner of Westeros bowed in courtesy, some sincerely, some merely performing the part. Joffrey had a seat at the center dais, with Margaery beside him. The high seat loomed beneath draping banners that bore the sigil of House Lannister, the proud golden lion, interwoven with the rose of House Tyrell. Across from them, Cersei sipped her wine, her blue-green eyes calculating. She watched Joffrey's interaction with Margaery almost as though studying a puzzle. Tyrion Lannister, the imp, was there as well, seated next to Sansa Stark, or Sansa Lannister, by the forced marriage the family had arranged to keep the North in check, though Joffrey was careful to avoid meeting his uncle's sardonic stare. Tywin, at the other end, conversed quietly with Olenna Tyrell, that famous Queen of Thorns. The old woman occasionally cast an assessing glance at the dais, while her granddaughter busied herself with small touches of conversation or an elegant tilt of her head that enchanted the crowd. Everything changed when Margaery rose halfway through the feast. She called for attention with a polite yet confident gesture. The din quieted, every gaze turning to her. "My lords and ladies," she said, her voice as smooth as honeyed wine, "today I celebrate my wedding to our king, Joffrey Baratheon. I count myself blessed beyond measure. But I also wish to celebrate the people of this fair city who have welcomed me with open arms. In honor of our marriage, I wish to announce that I, with my husband's blessing, will see that the city's orphans and poor are granted fresh loaves of bread each day for the next moon's turn." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And beyond that, we shall open the king's granaries so that no child need go hungry." A hush followed her words. All eyes flicked to Joffrey as though waiting to see if he would humiliate her, chastise her, or become angry at such a sudden charitable edict. He felt his mother's watchful gaze, his grandfather's stiff posture, but in that moment he recalled the young girl in the street that morning. He remembered the timid look in her eyes. And he realized something. These gestures of kindness were not weakness. They would make the people love him more than fear ever could. A spark in him wanted that love. Slowly he stood. He allowed himself a small smile, looking into Margaery's eyes, and then surveyed the onlookers. "The queen speaks true," he announced, voice surprisingly steady. "No child under my reign should ever fear starvation. Let it be known that King Joffrey and Queen Margaery stand united with the people. Let every house in King's Landing know that they have a king who cares for them and a queen who champions their needs." It was a different Joffrey who said those words, or perhaps it was the same boy who had discovered a better part of himself. A ripple of surprise and, yes, genuine approval fluttered through the crowd. Some knights, uncertain at the novelty of a generous Joffrey, followed with polite applause. Margaery glowed. When he sat down, she squeezed his hand beneath the table, her expression one of careful optimism. For once, he did not balk at the idea of being guided. Instead, he felt a sense of relief that she might help him become the king he never dreamed of trying to be. That evening, after the feast and its endless toasts, Joffrey and Margaery withdrew to their wedding chambers. The corridors of the Red Keep were dim and candlelit, and they said little as they walked together. Joffrey's heart thudded in his chest. For the first time, he felt awkward in the presence of a woman, though she was now his wife. The swirl of her wedding gown, the sweet aroma of roses in her hair, the gentle way her eyes studied him, he had never known such closeness. Rumors spread that he was a monster, that any woman who dared love him would find only cruelty. Yet he did not want to be that monster tonight. Part of him wondered if she was simply playing her part, the dutiful queen, or if she genuinely believed in his capacity to change. He remembered the times he had seen her among the small folk, the orphans, the wounded. The sincerity in her voice then matched the sincerity he saw in her eyes now. When they entered their chambers, she did not tremble in fear, nor did she goad him into aggression. Instead, she stepped calmly toward the bed, her movements poised. She turned to him, her hands folded in front of her. The question hung between them: how would they begin this new life together? But he was too young, too uncertain to find the right words. She broke the silence first. "I have faith that you can be a king the realm deserves," she said softly, placing a hand on his chest. "I will help you if you allow it." He stared at her, struck by the power of that simple statement. For the first time in his life, Joffrey Baratheon discovered what it felt like to desire someone's respect rather than demand it. He covered her hand with his own. The wedding night proceeded with a gentleness he had never thought himself capable of. Margaery's presence, her quiet confidence, became a guide. When morning came, they emerged as a royal couple truly united, perhaps not yet in perfect love, but in a mutual understanding that if they worked together, Westeros might see a different kind of rule. In the days that followed, the vow Margaery had made at the wedding feast was carried out. Loaves of bread were distributed among the poor, and indeed, the hungry children of Flea Bottom began to hope that someone in the Red Keep cared whether they lived or died. Some of the courtiers in King's Landing scoffed, whispering among themselves that the new queen was idealistic, or that the king was only indulging her for show. But the common folk began to speak differently of Joffrey. Instead of fearful hushes, there were murmurs that perhaps the boy king's heart could be softened. All of this stoked the jealousy and concern of Cersei Lannister. She was used to having a grip on her son, used to guiding his anger like a blade. For years, she had taught him that mercy was weakness. She had indulged his every cruelty, for she believed that power was safest when tempered by fear. And yet now, the young queen's influence was undeniable. Margaery had transformed public opinion almost overnight, and Joffrey seemed open to further transformations. Cersei confronted him one afternoon, her posture rigid as she stood in his solar, sunlight glinting off her golden hair. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You must be careful, Joffrey," she said, voice low. "Giving too much to the people will only make them greedy. They will come to expect even more. A king cannot simply open the coffers for every beggar that tugs at his cloak." The old Joffrey might have flinched under her admonishment, might have lashed out. This new Joffrey, still uncertain but trying to be stronger in a different way, stood firm. He met his mother's gaze. "I will rule as I see fit, mother. The people are not only beggars, they are also a resource. They fill our armies, our fields. They deserve more than scraps. If they starve, how long until they revolt?" She blinked, momentarily thrown off by his calm reasoning. "Tywin, your grandfather, knows these matters better than anyone," she tried again. "Let him guide you." "I will heed grandfather's counsel, but I am also king," Joffrey replied. "And the queen has shown me that generosity can bring loyalty as surely as fear does." Cersei's lips tightened. She studied him the way she might study an unexpected snake in her path. But there was something about Joffrey's tone that brooked no further argument. She inclined her head stiffly, then swept out of the room. It was a small victory, and Joffrey felt a surge of pride that he had stood his ground without resorting to childish anger. Perhaps Margaery was right, there was a better path. As the weeks turned into months, new challenges arose. The realm was still battered from the War of the Five Kings. Stannis Baratheon still resided at Dragonstone, licking his wounds and clinging to the notion that he was the rightful king. The North was a land at war with itself as Roose Bolton and his bannermen tried to maintain control after the so-called king in the North was killed at the Twins. Balon Greyjoy threatened the western coasts. Dorne eyed the Iron Throne with age-old resentment. And across the narrow sea, rumors persisted that Daenerys Targaryen, last daughter of a dynasty deposed, was amassing an army and dragons. Despite his newfound desire to be a better king, Joffrey still faced a kingdom splintered by distrust. Being just would not be enough if he did not also show strength. Margaery suggested forming alliances. "My grandmother and I have been speaking," she told him one evening in the royal gardens. "There are many lords still on uncertain footing. You should show them that your reign is stable, that you can reward loyalty generously and punish disloyalty decisively if need be. But only with fairness, not cruelty." She cast him a sidelong look. "Do you trust me?" He strolled beside her amid the neatly trimmed hedges and the heady scent of roses. He recalled the many times he had believed trust to be a weakness. Now he hesitated, but there was something about Margaery's unwavering poise that eased his fear of betrayal. "I do," he said softly. "Show me how." They began a campaign of conciliatory gestures to lesser lords. Margaery hosted feasts and tournaments in King's Landing where newly arrived knights could showcase their prowess. While it was customary for the king and queen to watch from the best seats, Joffrey made a point of acknowledging the efforts of even the humblest knights, offering personal thanks, awarding small knighthoods for bravery, and ensuring that they left the capital with their purses heavier and their hearts warmer. He learned the importance of courtesy, though he sometimes had to choke back his frustration when a knight performed poorly or when something bored him. Margaery's gentle hand on his arm was often enough to remind him to keep calm. Over time, the presence of Highgarden knights and their easy interactions with the city watch helped maintain order. Flea Bottom saw fewer riots. The Gold Cloaks, under new commands that discouraged needless cruelty, found it easier to keep the peace when the people weren't starving or terrified. Joffrey watched with guarded amazement as the city seemed to bloom under kindness. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Some of the older, more conservative lords viewed this new approach as weakness. Tywin Lannister, ever pragmatic, recognized the potential advantage in winning hearts, but remained wary. Generosity is well and good, but it must always be balanced with strength, he advised Joffrey one evening in the king's private council chamber. The table was scattered with reports, troop movements, trade updates, letters from the north. Tywin's flinty gaze weighed upon his grandson. The realm may grow to love you, but do not let them forget to fear you if it becomes necessary. Joffrey nodded, feeling the old tension creep up. I understand, grandfather. I will not forget. But if they love me first, then perhaps I will not need to rely on fear so often. Tywin's mouth curved into the ghost of a smile, though his eyes remained calculating. We shall see. In the meantime, Tyrion Lannister observed everything with a mixture of wary amusement and genuine curiosity. He had expected the worst from Joffrey, the same cruelty, the same brash impulsiveness that had once threatened his own life. Yet he saw the subtle transformation in the Boy King. When they crossed paths in the council meetings, Tyrion occasionally offered measured advice, half expecting it to be dismissed. Strangely enough, Joffrey began to listen. Their interactions remained guarded, for years of animosity did not vanish overnight, but Tyrion found he could speak without so much fear of reprisal. If you truly want to bring the lords to your side, he once told Joffrey in the small council chambers, consider granting small liberties. Allow them to feel their influence in their own lands is respected. A heavy hand from the Iron Throne may breed revolt, but a respectful ear might breed loyalty. Joffrey, who had never thought to heed the imp's advice, paused. Margaery stood by, quietly supportive. Tyrion added, dryly, and perhaps you'd have fewer reasons to chop off heads in the end. Though I know the headsmen might be disappointed to lose work. The old Joffrey might have responded with a slap or an insult. Instead, he looked to Margaery, who smiled. Then he turned back to Tyrion. It is worth considering, he said. And it was. Because being loved, or at least respected, felt better than standing alone with his crown and a city that only whispered of rebellion. Still, the realm required a demonstration of might. Reports came from the stepstones of pirates harassing merchants. Fleets from Storm's End were harried. Tywin insisted that the king must show resolve in dealing with lawlessness, so Joffrey prepared to muster ships under the royal banner. He stood at the harbor wearing black leather embroidered with gold threads, the crown perched on his head, Margaery by his side. A light breeze ruffled his hair as he gave the command for the Royal Navy to set sail. The watchers on the docks cheered, some out of duty, some out of genuine faith that this king might protect them from pirates. Joffrey felt the old sense of power surge, but it was different now. He wanted to protect his people, not simply to crush an enemy. When those same ships returned months later, victorious, carrying liberated cargoes and battered pirates in irons, King's Landing erupted in celebration. Banners streamed from every tower, and Joffrey presided over a triumphant parade of half-starved freed sailors thanking the crown for saving them. At Margaery's suggestion, Joffrey gifted the captains who fought bravely with lands or privileges. The pirates were displayed briefly as a warning, then swiftly judged in a newly revitalized court system that Tyrion had championed. A trial presided over by judges Joffrey had personally appointed for their sense of justice rather than their cruelty. When the pirates were eventually sentenced, it was done through a process that felt less arbitrary, less tainted by the old brutality that Joffrey might once have relished. Word spread through the realm that the king was strong and fair. Merchants from Bravos to Pentos took notice, increasing trade in King's Landing. Slowly, the treasury that had been nearly bled dry by war began to refill. All the while, Margaery remained at Joffrey's side, guiding him with subtle suggestions. Sometimes they clashed, he was still prone to fits of temper, and she was not always able to calm him. But even in his anger, Joffrey found himself pausing before lashing out. The memory of her disappointment was far more cutting than any slight from courtiers or lords. He began to realize that he could mend relationships with an apology or a kind word. On more than one occasion, an outburst in the throne room ended with him dismissing a courtier in a huff, only to later send a letter with a softened stance after Margaery spoke with him in private. "If you act too harshly, you lose supporters," she would remind him. "And a king's strength comes, in large part, from those who stand behind him willingly." The entire city took note of the shift. Where once Joffrey had marched through the streets in haughty arrogance, often behind the threat of gold cloaks, he now occasionally walked with Margaery among the commoners. The sight was unprecedented. They moved with a small guard, of course, but not the overwhelming show of intimidation that had once been the norm. The small folk, astonished, offered them whatever humble tokens they could: a wooden carving of a lion, a bunch of freshly picked daisies, a handful of sweet berries. Margaery accepted each gift with delight, passing some on to Joffrey. He thanked them stiffly at first, but over time he learned to smile in return. Gossip spread of how the king and queen had stopped by a local potter's stall where Margaery purchased a clay bowl while Joffrey listened to the potter's woes about his rising costs. The next day, the potter discovered new, more reasonable taxes on his trade, and soon other tradesmen, emboldened, brought their concerns forward too. Not every request was granted, but those that were merited earned Joffrey a swelling tide of goodwill. Inevitably, challenges arose. Queen Cersei's simmering discontent grew with every rumor that the king was taking more advice from Margaery than from his own mother. She bristled openly, searching for ways to reassert her influence. Lord Baelish, the sly Peter, took note of the changing winds, shifting his own maneuvers to ensure he stayed useful in a realm that demanded more transparency. Even Varys, master of whispers, found fewer whisperings of cruelty to feed upon, which in turn forced him to weave new webs that might catch glimpses of the realm's enemies. Meanwhile, Tywin plotted to ensure that House Lannister retained its central power, forging new alliances in the Westerlands and ensuring the Tyrells did not overshadow them. But Margaery's grandmother, Olenna, was no fool, and the Lannisters found it was wise to maintain a cordial relationship rather than risk the scorn of the mightiest house in the Reach. Through careful diplomacy and a willingness on Joffrey's part to listen, these tensions remained a slow burn rather than an open fire. Out in the lands beyond King's Landing, however, trouble brewed. Lords who had sided with Stannis still watched from afar. Some quietly admired the Kinder monarchy while others believed it to be a ploy. The Iron Islands under Balon Greyjoy continued their raiding. But Joffrey was quick to authorize additional naval patrols, having learned the value of safe seas. When Euron Greyjoy seized the Seastone chair after Balon's mysterious death, he threatened to lash out with a newly formed fleet. The realm prepared for war once again. Many believed Joffrey would revert to type, the petulant, sadistic child king who would crush and burn the Iron Islands. Instead, Joffrey called a war council. Every relevant lord was invited to speak. Even some who had previously stood against him were given a chance to plead their case for leniency or present their plans for how to handle the Ironborn threat. Some left the meeting shocked, for the king had actually listened, questioning them, challenging them, but not merely insulting or threatening. Decisions were made with strategic clarity. By the time the royal fleet engaged Euron Greyjoy at sea, it was with a plan formed by the best minds of Westeros rather than the whim of a tyrant. The battles were harsh. Westeros was never free of violence, but the difference lay in how Joffrey managed it. When the Ironborn were defeated off the coast of Fair Isle, Joffrey offered terms of surrender to those who would yield. They would be shown mercy if they bent the knee, pledged loyalty to the crown, and refrained from further raiding. Some scorned this mercy, demanding an Ironborn death at sea. Others quietly accepted. Even those who surrendered warily recognized that this king was unlike the monstrous boy rumored at the beginning of the war. And though not all the Ironborn bent the knee, some scattered to the edges of the Sunset Sea. Enough did so that the threat was significantly diminished. Word of this more measured approach solidified Joffrey's standing among the houses of Westeros. The boy king was growing into a just ruler. Meanwhile, Margaery's presence in the capital blossomed into far-reaching projects. She organized charitable works for war orphans and proposed the expansion of the city's primary orphanage. Tyrion, seeing an opportunity for good publicity and practical relief, managed to secure the crown's funds in a way that minimized corruption, a near miracle in King's Landing. Joffrey, for his part, personally visited the site of the new construction, ensuring workers were well treated. The people gaped at the idea that the king himself would check on such things. It was as if a new wind blew through the city, carrying with it a cautious optimism. Among the common folk, rumors spread of the queen's unwavering influence on the king's new policies. Some older men who remembered Robert Baratheon's early days compared Joffrey's transformation to the blossoming of a flower. Younger folk believed that love had softened his heart. Many women admired Margaery for her success in taming the notoriously cruel boy. There were still pockets of doubt, of course. One could not dismiss the memory of Joffrey forcing Sansa Stark to look at her father's head or his near execution of that same girl in a rage. But in a place like King's Landing, a current good deed often overshadowed past sins as long as the city was prosperous. And so Joffrey's legend began to change from that of a vicious princeling to a king who might actually care for his subjects. Still, the shift was fragile. The greatest test of all came in the form of a northern rebellion. After the fall of the young wolf, the north had splintered. Some lords had bent the knee to the Iron Throne under the Bolton's claim. Others had gone into hiding, refusing to swear loyalty to a family they despised for betraying the Starks. Rumor claimed a surviving Stark might still be in the winds, rallying northern men to retake Winterfell from the Boltons. Tywin insisted that any hint of a Stark resurgence must be crushed, but Margaery suggested negotiation. "You can't hold a land as vast as the North by force alone," she told Joffrey, late at night in their chambers. "They have fought wars that lasted generations. If you wish to keep the peace, you must offer them something worth having." Joffrey, who remembered Sansa Stark's quiet dignity and the tragedy that befell her family, felt uneasy. He was not proud of how House Lannister had orchestrated the Red Wedding, even if it had ended the war swiftly. A just king, he realized, should not allow such treachery to define his reign. "If there is a Stark heir," he mused, pacing by the flickering candlelight, "I might offer him or her a fair arrangement. The North returned to their governance under the Crown's protection. In exchange, they swear loyalty. No more rebellions. But the Boltons." He trailed off, remembering that Roose Bolton had sworn allegiance to the throne after turning on Robb Stark. Through betrayal, Bolton had gained the wardenship of the North. But his cruelty and that of his bastard son was infamous. How could Joffrey call himself a just king if he allowed such men to rule an entire region? Margaery came to stand before him, touching his arm softly. "You are king," she reminded him, "and such decisions are yours to make. Choose well, and you may earn the North's loyalty, truly earn it, not through fear, but through respect." So he summoned Roose Bolton to King's Landing under the guise of needing counsel for the region's troubles. Bolton arrived, sleek and pale, his eyes flicking about the court with caution. Beside him was his son, Ramsay, a lurking presence that set the courtiers on edge. In a private audience, Joffrey studied their manner, outwardly deferential, inwardly calculating. Bolton tried to curry favor, praising the king's wise rule, even complimenting the queen. Ramsay, for his part, mostly stared at the throne, a sneer hidden behind feigned respect. Joffrey had never much liked the Boltons, though he once might have admired their capacity for cruelty. Now he found them unsettling. He thought of the rumors of flayed men, of Sansa Stark's troubles in the North. After hearing them out, Joffrey said, "We have reason to believe there is a living Stark who seeks to raise the North against us. If we are to maintain peace, I must know where you stand." Bolton bowed, low and smooth. "My king, House Bolton stands with you, as always." Ramsay added, "These rumors of a Stark are unfounded, I assure you. The North knows who their rightful warden is." Joffrey's jaw tightened. He was no fool to dismiss the possibility that the Boltons would lie. But part of him was glad to see Margaery watching from a discreet distance, reassuring him with her presence. "If a Stark does rise," Joffrey went on, "and you wish to keep your titles, you will treat them with the same courtesy you show me. There will be no flaying, no torture." The words caught in his throat, for it still felt strange to threaten a lord with moral constraints rather than swords, but he continued, "I will have order in the North. If it is discovered that you have mistreated any innocents or any recognized heirs of Winterfell, you will answer to the crown." Silence fell. Bolton, who was an expert at hiding emotion, showed only a slight twitch in his eyes. Ramsay, on the other hand, looked like a dog straining on a leash. His lips parted in some unspoken protest. But Joffrey pressed on, stepping into the role Margaery had been patiently teaching him, the role of a just but firm king. "I am offering you the chance to keep your station, Lord Bolton, if you hold the North together peacefully. But if the North rejects you, I will not stand in their way. If a legitimate Stark heir appears and can command their bannermen's loyalty, I will see them recognized. Then it will be up to you and your house to prove your worth in their eyes as well as mine." A stunned look crossed Bolton's face before he smoothed it over. "Your Grace is most understanding. We will, of course, do all we can to maintain your peace." Joffrey dismissed them shortly thereafter, aware that he had essentially put the Boltons on notice. If a Stark truly did emerge, whether it be Sansa, Bran, Rickon, or even Jon Snow, if rumors held that the Night's Watch brother was more than he seemed, Joffrey was prepared to allow them their ancestral rights, so long as they bent the knee to him in peace. It was a remarkable departure from the old, ruthless approach, and it sent shockwaves through the realm. Some believed it was weakness that the king would cede territory. Others saw it for what it was, a carefully calculated move to earn the North's trust, something that could never be bought with threats alone. Not long after, Joffrey received a quiet piece of news. Sansa Stark had fled King's Landing with the help of Peter Baelish, only to be married off to Ramsay Bolton in a horrifying attempt to cement alliances in the north. But the northern lords revolted at the atrocity, and Sansa escaped with the help of allies loyal to her house. Soon, banners across the north rose under the dire wolf once more, rallying around the last known Stark in Winterfell. Torn letters arrived at King's Landing describing a northern rebellion that aimed to oust the Boltons. Joffrey, hearing of Sansa's personal suffering, felt a pang of guilt. He remembered her tear-streaked face the day he had forced her to look at her father's head. He remembered how he had tormented her for no reason other than his own twisted pleasure. He remembered how easy it had been to watch her cower. Now, she was leading a rebellion of sorts, or at least was a figurehead for it, maybe not by choice, but the North rallied around her. The small council looked to Joffrey for guidance. Tywin pressed for immediate intervention to quell the unrest. Cersei snarled at the mention of Sansa Stark, calling her a traitor. Margaery, however, only said this might be an opportunity. She will not trust you easily, but if you show her clemency, perhaps the North will lay down their arms. Joffrey was torn. He pictured Sansa's haunted eyes, pictured how he had once wanted to break her spirit simply because he could. Could he truly turn around now and offer her peace and justice? Would she ever accept it? In the end, he penned a letter himself, sealed with the king's own seal, addressed to Lady Sansa Stark of Winterfell, offering her terms: bend the knee and I will acknowledge you as the rightful Lady of Winterfell. The crown will not interfere with your rule, provided you remain loyal to the Iron Throne. Roose Bolton's crimes shall be investigated, and if found guilty, he will be stripped of his titles. We will also investigate any offenses committed by others in the North. Peace can be ours if you lay aside your arms. He did not know if she would believe a single word. But with Margaery's encouragement, he pressed the seal upon the letter, and it was dispatched north with all haste. Weeks passed without answer, tension building. War seemed inevitable. Then, on a crisp morning when the biting wind howled across the city's rooftops, a raven arrived. The seal bore the wolf's head of House Stark. Joffrey read it in private, Margaery leaning over his shoulder. Sansa's reply was cautious, uncertain. She expressed disbelief that the king could be sincere, but she admitted that if the Boltons were truly to be held accountable and if the North would be free to govern itself under the ancient laws, she might be persuaded to discuss terms. Without hesitation, Joffrey made preparations. He would travel north, he announced, to settle the matter personally. The court was stunned. Kings seldom left their capitals for the uncertain roads, especially not to treat with a once-treasured hostage who'd become a rebel figure. Tywin advised sending an envoy. Cersei was apoplectic. But Joffrey insisted. A king who cannot ride out to his people is no king at all, he proclaimed. The North deserves to see my face, to hear my words, not just scraps of parchment. Margaery volunteered to accompany him. He hesitated, not wanting to put her in danger, but she insisted. If you seek to prove your sincerity, there is no greater sign than bringing your queen, who is known for her empathy. So they prepared a royal procession. Not the lavish entourage of hundreds that might provoke fear or hamper speed, but a smaller group, knights loyal to the crown, some members of the King's Guard, a handful of trusted advisors. Tyrion was invited, but he shook his head ruefully. I fear I'd be more hindrance than help in the North. It would be a pity to lose my nose to frostbite. He did, however, offer a parting piece of advice. Remember, nephew, the North is vast and its people proud. They do not bend easily, but once loyal, they are loyal forever. Offer them your respect and they might surprise you. The journey was long and grueling. Winter's chill had begun to creep through the air, dusting the King's Road with a thin layer of frost. Each day, as they traveled further from the warmth of the south, Joffrey could feel tension coil in his stomach. The nights were cold, the wind biting. Margaery, though unaccustomed to such harsh weather, bore it with fortitude, wrapped in furs. She encouraged Joffrey to join her in greeting local villagers along the way, showing them that the king was not above stepping into the muddy roads. Some of these people had never laid eyes on a king before. They were awed by the notion that he might dismount his horse and speak to them, that the queen might ask about their children. They reached Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that marked the entrance to the north, and found it occupied by a mix of Bolton men and Stark loyalists, each uncertain what to do about the king's arrival. Tensions ran high. But upon seeing the king approach, they lowered weapons, for Joffrey did not come in an army's might but with a modest retinue that carried both the Lion of Lannister and the dire Wolf of Stark on a shared banner, his own design, a sign of parley. Word spread northward, the king had come, seeking peace with Sansa Stark. Finally, they approached Winterfell, the ancient seat of House Stark, rising gray and solemn from the surrounding countryside. Smoke curled from the towers, signs of recent habitation. Even from a distance, Joffrey could see the scars of war on the walls. Portions were burned, scaffolding was in place for repairs. As they drew near, he felt a tightening in his chest. His last memories of Sansa were in King's Landing, the final humiliations he had foisted upon her. Now he was riding into what was essentially her domain. He spared a glance at Margaery, who squeezed his hand reassuringly. At the gates of Winterfell, guards wearing Stark livery stood watch. They opened the gates slowly, as though uncertain. Within the courtyard, snow crunched underfoot. The king's party dismounted in silence, knights scanning the surroundings warily. From across the courtyard, Sansa Stark emerged, flanked by lords of the north. Her hair was a deep auburn, the color vivid against the gray stones and snow. She stood tall, a mix of apprehension and determination etched on her pale face. She wore a heavy cloak emblazoned with the dire wolf, and Joffrey realized that she Finn. Ale looked like the Lady of Winterfell she had been born to be. Time felt suspended as they regarded one another. If she felt fear or anger, she hid it behind a mask of composure. Joffrey, heart pounding, stepped forward. He removed his gloves, tucking them into his belt. "Lady Sansa," he said, voice echoing slightly in the cold air. He bowed deep and slow. The action stunned the onlookers, for never had they seen Joffrey Baratheon bow to anyone of lesser rank. Sansa's eyes widened. Then she inclined her head in an almost courteous manner. "Your Grace," she responded, her tone carefully neutral. It was a beginning. They spoke in the great hall that afternoon, a muted conversation witnessed by the assembled lords, houses that had once bent the knee to House Stark, some that had sided with the Boltons, others uncertain who to trust. Margaery sat close to Joffrey's side, offering quiet encouragement. Joffrey read out the terms he had penned: acknowledgement of Sansa Stark as Lady of Winterfell and Warden of the North, the official censure and removal of Roose Bolton from that role, and a promise that the crown would support Winterfell's rebuilding and the feeding of its people. In exchange, Sansa would reaffirm her loyalty to the Iron Throne, pay a fair tax to the crown, and keep the king informed of any further threats to the realm that might emerge from beyond the wall. Stark and Lannister sealing a new alliance, unthinkable months before. Many of the northern lords shifted uncomfortably, recalling the atrocities committed against the Stark family. Some questioned how they could ever trust a Lannister or a Baratheon after what happened at the Red Wedding. But Sansa, eyes never leaving Joffrey's, asked him the hardest question of all. "What makes you think I can trust you after all you have done?" Her voice was steady, but the pain under it was plain. A hush fell. Every ear in the hall strained. Margaery reached for Joffrey's hand beneath the table. Joffrey cleared his throat, struggling with words that did not come easily. He stood, slow and deliberate, glancing around at the gathering lords, then fixing his gaze on Sansa. "I cannot erase the past," he said, the echo of the hall giving his voice a somber resonance. "You have no reason to trust me, save one. I am not the boy I once was. My cruelty shamed me. I see that now. I offer you my apology and the promise of a king who wishes to be just. I know words are cheap. So I offer you more than words. I offer you the North, your birthright, because I believe it is just. All I ask is that we not spill more blood. The realm is weary of war." Gasps rose among the crowd. Sansa did not speak for a long moment, her eyes flicking from Joffrey to Margaery to the men behind them and back again. Slowly she rose. She seemed older, more regal than the frightened girl who once cowered in King's Landing. "I accept your apology," she said at last, though caution still danced in her gaze, "and the terms that come with it. I will bend the knee to you as king if that is what it takes to ensure peace for the North. But if you ever break this faith, I will never again trust the Iron Throne. And the North remembers." Joffrey nodded, fighting the urge to sigh in relief. It was done, at least for now. A hush fell over the hall as Sansa came forward. She knelt, pressing her knee to the cold stone floor. He stepped forward, raising her by the hand, granting her the respect befitting the Lady of Winterfell. Applause broke out from those who had dared to dream of peace. Others grumbled, but their dissent was muffled by the overall sense of relief that yet another war might be avoided. In the weeks that followed, Joffrey and Margaery remained in Winterfell to see that the changes took root. A formal decree stripped Roose Bolton of his wardenship. He slunk away, presumably to regroup with the few lords still loyal to him. Ramsay disappeared, rumored to be haunting the northern countryside. But for the most part, the North rallied around Sansa, and with that rally came a grudging acknowledgement that King Joffrey had acted with an unexpected sense of justice. The winter nights in Winterfell were long. Margaery and Joffrey took their meals in the Great Hall, seated near Sansa, forging a tentative camaraderie. They spoke of the challenges to come, the rumored White Walkers beyond the wall, the possible threat from Daenerys Targaryen across the sea, the continuing recovery of the realm from the War of the Five Kings. Some nights, the two queens would talk quietly, one a Stark by blood, the other a Tyrell by birth, both forging an uneasy path in a world dominated by men's wars. Joffrey, still prone to occasional outbursts, found that the harsh climate and the stern attitudes of the North tested his patience. But every time his old temper flared, he recalled the vow he had made to be the king the realm deserved. He saw the bright flush of anger in Sansa's face when he snapped, and he forced himself to calm. He remembered Margaery's gentle guidance. Step by step, he learned restraint. When at last the king and queen departed from Winterfell, heading south again, it was with an escort of loyal Northmen who saw them safely across the neck. Sansa stood on the battlements to watch them leave, her cloak fluttering in the icy wind. She raised a hand in a measured, distant salute. Joffrey, from his horse, inclined his head before turning away. It was not a friendship, not yet. But it was a start, and in Westeros, small starts could grow into legends if nurtured. Upon returning to King's Landing, Joffrey found the city had not collapsed in his absence. Tyrion had ably managed the finances, and Margaery's designated regent, the capable Ser Loras Tyrell, her brother, had helped keep order. Cersei lurked at court, powerless to stop the changes, though she doubtless resented them. Grand Maester Pycelle had died in his sleep, and a new maester took his place, a younger man who seemed eager to modernize the Citadel's relationship with the throne. Slowly, in ways large and small, the capital adjusted to a king who believed in more than mere cruelty. That is not to say all was well. Letters still arrived from the east, speaking of the unburnt, the mother of dragons, Daenerys Targaryen. And Stannis remained at Dragonstone, though his power seemed diminished. The Iron Islands were never fully docile, and Dorne watched from afar, waiting for any excuse to avenge old grievances. The realm would never be entirely without threats. But there was a newfound sense that perhaps those threats could be managed without tearing Westeros apart. There was room for negotiations, for alliances, for practical solutions beyond endless war. In the Red Keep's courtyard, Joffrey began a new tradition. Once a moon's turn, he would hold open court, hearing petitions from commoners and lords alike. Margaery would sit beside him, helping him keep his composure. Courtiers who were used to the old ways found themselves confounded by how often the king ruled with surprising fairness. A blacksmith sought redress for a knight who refused payment. The king demanded the knight's presence, listened to both sides, and ruled that the knight must pay thrice the amount in reparation. A farmer complained that a lord's men-at-arms had trampled his fields. Joffrey had them replaced at the lord's expense. Each time, he felt the city's mood lighten. The people, once terrified, began to harbor genuine admiration for their king. He was not beloved by all. Whispers of his past still lingered. Men who had witnessed his sadistic nature sometimes looked upon him with suspicion. But the difference was that he no longer took pleasure in petty cruelty. When retribution had to be exacted, it was done through law, not whim. Slowly, the city's darkest alleys, once full of rebels and schemers, began to quiet. Even the streets patrolled by the gold cloaks were calmer, though one could never purge King's Landing of crime entirely. At night, in the privacy of their chambers, Margaery and Joffrey spoke of the future. She would read to him letters from across the realm, showing him which alliances were still fragile, which might be strengthened. He would nod, listening, occasionally looking out the window at the dark sprawl of the city. "I want them to be safe," he would say sometimes. "I want them to know that their king is not the monster they once feared." It was an honesty he rarely displayed to anyone but her. She would place a hand on his arm, feeling the tension beneath. The weight of the crown, once a symbol of absolute power, had become a near-crushing responsibility. Yet she would smile, reminding him that he did not bear it alone. 2 years passed in this manner, a time of cautious prosperity for King's Landing. It was not utopia, far from it. But the city had recovered from the worst of its war-torn hunger. The crown's finances, under the guidance of Tyrion and the renewed trade partnerships, slowly climbed out of debt. The Tyrells invested in rebuilding roads, encouraging commerce between the Reach and the capital, which in turn brought more food into the city. The lines of hungry small folk at the gates diminished. piracy in the narrow sea, once rampant, was kept in check by the Royal Navy. Sansa Stark ruled the North with a firm but fair hand, occasionally exchanging letters with Joffrey in which they discussed trade or the movement of suspicious factions. Though trust remained tentative, neither side had broken the new peace. Crises came and went, as crises do, but the realm weathered them with less bloodshed than in the days of the War of the Five Kings. When Tywin Lannister finally passed away in his sleep, many feared that the realm would be cast into turmoil again, for Tywin had been the staunch pillar of House Lannister's might. But by then, Joffrey had established himself as a king who could stand on his own. Margaery's influence continued to temper him. The old guard of Lannister loyalists found it more lucrative to follow a stable king than to cause unrest, so the transition was surprisingly smooth. Cersei, still grieving the loss of her father, found her son slipping further from her control, but had little choice but to accept it. The king had grown taller, more certain of himself, no longer the petulant boy who had once reveled in cruelty. In fact, the biggest shift came when, in an effort to unite the realm further, Joffrey commanded that the surviving lords of the Seven Kingdoms gather in King's Landing for a grand council. It was a bold move, inviting them to discuss matters of law, trade, and security. Every corner of the realm was represented. The Vale of Arryn, now under the guardianship of new stewards, the Riverlands still healing from the scars of war, the Westerlands loyal to House Lannister, the Reach under House Tyrell, the Stormlands with many lords returning to the fold, the Iron Islands with a delegation carefully watched, and Dorne, who arrived with an air of regal defiance but came nonetheless. Even the North sent representatives on behalf of Lady Sansa Stark, though she herself remained in Winterfell. The Grand Council convened in the Great Hall of the Red Keep, the Iron Throne looming behind Joffrey. Margaery sat at his right hand, while a newly appointed hand of the king, surprisingly chosen from among the more moderate lords, sat at his left. Tyrion moved among them, offering suggestions and jabs in equal measure. Together, they debated trade routes, the differences in northern laws versus southern laws, inheritance rights, and more. It was an unprecedented gathering of viewpoints, and while arguments flared, no swords were drawn. Joffrey used a measured tone, intervening when necessary, letting others speak when beneficial. The subtle art of kingship that he had once disdained was now something he worked at diligently. By the end of the council, new accords were signed, forging trade pacts between the North and the Reach, clarifying the Iron Islands obligations, and officially reinstating House Stark as Wardens of the North. Dorne walked away with a promise of greater autonomy in certain local laws, a concession that quieted their long-standing anger. It was a far cry from the savage court the realm had once known. That night, after the Grand Council concluded, King Joffrey and Queen Margaery hosted a feast. Musicians played soft tunes, the smell of roasted boar and spiced wine filling the air. 1,000 candles illuminated the throne room, banishing shadows to the corners. Lord after lord came to pay their respects, offering toasts to the king. Joffrey accepted them gracefully, though he could see a few forced smiles. Some men would never truly accept him, given his reputation. But the difference was that now they feared his rightful authority, not his cruelty alone. And a number of them offered genuine praise. Margaery slipped an arm through his, guiding him to the dais to address the assembled lords. Joffrey raised a cup. His voice carried clearly across the hall. "My lords, ladies, and all who serve this realm, I thank you for coming. We have seen too much war in these past years. The blood spilled cannot be undone. But together we have taken steps toward a peace that might endure. Let us pledge ourselves to the realm we share, and let us ensure that the Iron Throne stands for justice, not fear. May our children look upon this time as the dawn of a better era." Cheers rose, and Joffrey caught Margaery's eye, seeing quiet pride there. Tyrion sipped his wine in the background, a faint smile curling his lips as though he, too, was surprised by how far his nephew had come. Highgarden bannermen toasted with their Reach allies, while some Lannister knights barked approvingly, banging their gauntlets on the table. The wave of applause and good cheer washed over the throne room. Later that evening, after the revelries had died down, Joffrey found himself alone in the corridor, gazing out a narrow window at the sleeping city. The sky was a black vault studded with stars. Fires twinkled among the rooftops. King's Landing had never looked so peaceful to him. He recalled with shame how once he'd considered all these people mere subjects to be tormented or toyed with. It felt like a lifetime ago. The crown weighed on his brow, but in it he found a new sense of responsibility. He felt footsteps behind him and turned to see Margaery approaching, her gown trailing along the stone floor. She studied him with that calm, supportive gaze he had grown to cherish. "You've done well," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He drew a breath. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her eyes sparkled in the torchlight. "Perhaps not. But you chose to listen, Joffrey. You chose to change. You chose to be more than the world expected." He looked out again at the city, the faint glow of the moon illuminating the walls. "For so long, I believed I was beyond hope," he murmured. "But if a king cannot change, then how can a realm ever change? I've learned that I can be stronger through justice than I ever was through cruelty." She nodded. A soft hush passed between them, comforting in its warmth. They stood there like that for a time, husband and wife, king and queen, watching over the city they both held in their hearts. It was not a perfect world. Westeros never was. But there, in the quiet night, with the wind carrying the distant whisper of a new age, it felt like the start of something truly good. And so the realm of the Seven Kingdoms, under the reign of King Joffrey Baratheon and Queen Margaery Tyrell, found a tenuous but hopeful peace. Though threats would come and challenges would rise, the once feared boy king had chosen a different path. A path that might, in time, become legend. Where once tales of him centered on his sadism, now the minstrels began to compose ballads of a king who learned kindness from his queen, who sought to rebuild what war had broken, and who took steps toward uniting a fractured kingdom. Children born after the wars would grow up with stories of the king who was stern but fair, passionate yet tempered by empathy. In that delicate balance, Westeros discovered that redemption was possible even for a boy shaped by cruelty, provided there was someone like Margaery Tyrell to show him a better way, and provided he found the courage within himself to follow it. Winter's approach was heralded by the deepening gloom in the sky over King's Landing. The wind carried a sharper bite each evening, and the days grew short enough that torches had to be lit early, creating a flickering glow along the city's walls. In the Red Keep, the change in weather brought with it an undercurrent of tension, for while King Joffrey's reformed court had settled the realm into a far gentler peace than anyone had expected, all of Westeros knew that a longer, harsher winter might bring a host of new problems. Yet, in the midst of that apprehension, the capital remained relatively prosperous. Merchants called out in the bustling markets, gold cloaks patrolled with more courtesy than cruelty, and small folk labored with fewer reasons to fear sudden royal whims. The transformations that had taken hold under Joffrey's watchful eye felt unexpectedly durable. And still, each time a gust of cold air rolled in from the north, every mind with sense enough remembered that peace in Westeros was rarely permanent. Joffrey himself stood on a balcony that overlooked Blackwater Bay, the sea air tugging at his cloak, the city sprawling beneath him like a tableau in shades of orange and gray as the sun lowered to the horizon. He was no longer the slight boy he had been when he first took the throne. He had grown in height and in bearing. He wore a lined cloak of deep crimson, the golden lion of Lannister embroidered along the trim. His face had hardened into the angles of young manhood, but there was a gravity in his eyes that had never been there before. Sometimes he scarcely recognized the memory of his old self, an angry, insecure boy lashing out at the world. That memory felt like a phantom from a dream. He turned slightly at the sound of footsteps and saw Margaery approaching. She was wrapped in furs despite the crispness of the day, her hair pinned up to protect her from the wind, though a few soft curls drifted across her cheek. She gave him a smile that warmed him more than any cloak could. In public, she was every inch the regal queen, self-assured, gracious, a master of courtesy and subtlety. In private, there was a gentleness and humor she offered him that sometimes took him by surprise. He felt he was still learning the depths of his own wife's spirit. "The ships from Dorne have arrived," she said. "They bring not only wines and spices, but also a small delegation to confirm the trade pacts we finalized at the Grand Council. They asked to meet with you at your convenience." He nodded, letting the sea air fill his lungs as he stood a moment longer. "They likely want to renegotiate or at least confirm that everything is still in order," he replied, his tone measured. "It never ends, does it?" Margaery's eyes sparkled. "Perhaps not, but we can take heart that they traveled here to do it peacefully. Better 100 trade discussions than one war." He allowed himself a small smile at that. "You're right." He gently linked his fingers with hers, gazing out at the ocean. "We've come so far. Sometimes I wonder if the realm truly trusts me, or if they're all waiting for me to show my old colors. If they were waiting for that, most would have given up by now, she replied softly, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. But trust is earned again and again. We can't rest on past accomplishments forever. He considered that, gazing at the horizon where the sky bled into the sea. Then let's make sure these Dornish lords see who I am now, he said, a determined edge in his voice. No cause for suspicion. We'll treat them with the courtesy they deserve. If we do, perhaps they'll carry a better tale back to Sunspear. She inclined her head. Very well. Shall we see them in the throne room? He nodded, parted from her hand, and they walked side by side, heading back into the corridors. Servants bowed as they passed, stepping aside quickly. Joffrey noticed them glance up with something like cautious admiration. That look was still unfamiliar to him, but he was slowly becoming used to it. He recalled a time when these very servants cringed with fear if they so much as heard his footsteps in a hallway. Now they seemed almost relieved to see him. As the servants hurried ahead to announce the king and queen's arrival, he felt a flicker of pride. Change was possible. He had proven it to them and to himself. They made their way to the throne room, which had been rearranged from the days of constant hostility. The Iron Throne remained in its imposing place, the swords of Aegon's enemies still forming its jagged silhouette. Yet the atmosphere beneath it was less suffocating than in years past. Banners of House Baratheon and House Tyrell draped the walls, offset by the gold and red colors of House Lannister. Tall, narrow windows admitted slants of light that gleamed on the polished marble. As Joffrey settled onto the Iron Throne, he noticed that the old sense of sharp discomfort the seat had always pricked him at times was less important now. He wore thick fabrics, and his posture had improved. He sat as a king should, with a confidence that came not from intimidation alone but from his sense of justice. The Dornish envoys were ushered in. Lord Ferrego Ormalin, who served as a trade advisor to Dor and Martell, bowed deeply. At his side, a younger noblewoman in a flowing robe reminiscent of Dornish sands performed a graceful curtsy. They wore bright colors, oranges and reds woven into swirling patterns that clashed only slightly with the more subdued designs of King's Landing. Joffrey lifted a hand, signaling them to rise. "Your Grace," said Lord Ferrego, voice echoing through the hall. "We bring felicitations from Prince Dor and Martell, who wishes to extend his gratitude for the renewed trade agreements between our fair Dorne and the Crown. We have found the flow of goods has already improved the livelihoods of many Dornish merchants." "I'm pleased to hear it," Joffrey responded. "You traveled a long way. I hope you were comfortable on the road." "As comfortable as one can be traveling from Sunspear to King's Landing," the young woman replied, a teasing hint in her smile. "We come bearing gifts as well, a small token from the gardens of Sunspear." She clapped her hands, and servants in Dornish attire stepped forward, presenting a long wooden chest inlaid with designs of serpents. Inside, Joffrey glimpsed small jars of scented oils, spiced preserves, and even a few finely worked trinkets shaped like suns. Joffrey thanked them politely, recalling how once he might have responded with arrogance or demanded more. Instead, he asked after Prince Doran's health and graciously invited the Dornish envoys to dine at the royal table that evening, where they could discuss details of trade. Margaery chimed in with an offer to show them her personal gardens, which were not as lush as the famed water gardens of Dorne but still contained many southern blooms that thrived in King's Landing's mild climate. At the mention of gardens, the envoys bowed again with genuine pleasure. By the time the formalities concluded, the tension that often clung to meetings with Dornish representatives was eased, replaced by the sense that they might truly be forging better relations. When the Dornish party withdrew, Tyrion approached. He had been watching from a discreet position near one of the pillars. "I must commend you, nephew," he said in a low voice, glancing up with a wry smile. "There was a time when such a meeting might have ended with threats or rash demands. Now you're practically the model of gracious kingship." Joffrey descended the steps, adjusting the golden circlet on his brow. He still wore the official crown, but it was lighter than the heavy one with rubies he had often used in the past. "I only do what needs doing. Dorne is too important to antagonize. Besides, it was a straightforward matter." Tyrion nodded, though his mismatched eyes glinted with curiosity. "That's what good governance is, in part, making the straightforward matters remain so and not creating enemies needlessly. You've learned that lesson quite well." He cast a look at Margaery, who was stepping aside to speak with a herald. "I think you and your queen have become quite adept at showing the rest of us how to walk the line between courtesy and authority." Joffrey had to wonder if Tyrion was mocking him with faint praise, but there was something earnest in his uncle's tone. In years past, Joffrey would not have believed Tyrion capable of earnestly supporting him. But so much had changed. They no longer barked at each other with immediate hostility. He recognized that Tyrion had proven invaluable in matters of finance and trade, bridging the gap that once existed between the crown and the Iron Bank of Bravos. They had staved off crushing debt and even begun paying it down, a feat few would have believed possible when Joffrey first ascended the throne in chaos. He nodded to Tyrion. "I appreciate your counsel, uncle. Perhaps you might join the feasting tonight and help me keep these Dornish lords happy. They'll doubtless have more to say." Tyrion took a half-step back, inclining his head with a flourish. "But of course, I never could resist a good feast, especially when the wine is Dornish." Joffrey allowed a smile to curve his lips. "Try to make sure you remember the evening this time." He recalled that Tyrion's fondness for drink sometimes led to fuzzy memories. His uncle chuckled wryly and turned away to oversee some detail of the arrangements for the feast. That night, the Red Keep's great hall was alight with candles, torches, and polished lanterns. A mild breeze from the sea offered a little relief from the press of bodies, for though winter was on the horizon, it was not yet cold enough to fully chill the evening. Banners from various houses fluttered in the high rafters, and the tables were piled with roasted meats, fresh bread, spiced vegetables, and an array of fruits. Cooks from the kitchens had also prepared the Dornish peppers the delegation had brought, incorporating them into dishes that both intrigued and occasionally overwhelmed the less spice-hardy palates of the city's courtiers. Music swirled between the columns, and servants rushed with wine pitchers to fill the cups of guests. Joffrey presided at the high table with Margaery to his right. Lord Ferrego Ormalin sat near them, engaged in pleasant conversation about Dorne's bountiful crops and their latest experiments in irrigation. Sansa Stark's empty seat remained a subtle reminder of the new dynamic. The king had effectively returned the North to House Stark. She no longer resided in King's Landing, and that was how it should be. Tyrion was seated further along, regaling a few Tyrell knights with some anecdote involving goats and the Vale, drawing half-smiles from them. Halfway through the feast, Joffrey rose to make a small toast. The hum of conversation quieted as everyone turned their attention to the king. He lifted his goblet, filled with sweet, mild wine. "My lords, ladies, and honored guests, I welcome our Dornish friends to King's Landing. House Martell's generosity in trade and their dedication to peace have not gone unnoticed. Let us toast to unity across the 7 kingdoms." With that, he sipped, and a chorus of voices repeated variations of "to unity." The music resumed, conversation rippled, and the feast wore on in good spirits. When at last the night drew to a close, many courtiers departed in high humor. Some of the Dornish visitors lingered in small clusters, exchanging courteous farewells with other lords. Joffrey noted that a few men from the Westerlands and a handful of Reach bannermen stood side by side with the newcomers, discussing the potential for broader alliances. It was precisely the sort of inter-house mingling that was rare in the old days, a sign that the Grand Council's ripple effects were still spreading. Eventually, Joffrey and Margaery retired. They strolled through the corridors to their private apartments, escorted by a pair of King Guard. Even the white-cloaked knights seemed at ease. Their watchfulness was not the rigid, fearful stance of men expecting chaos at any moment. In their bedchamber, Margaery removed her jewelry, setting aside the glittering rose-shaped pins in a small chest. Joffrey discarded his crown on a nearby table, running a hand through his hair. He felt weary but satisfied. Margaery turned toward him, her dark green eyes reflective in the candlelight. "Did you see how eager the Dornish were to discuss future trade expansions? They're hoping to export more of their goods through the Rose Road. I believe it's a profitable opportunity." He nodded, slipping off his outer cloak. "We'll discuss it more formally in the next council session. I want to be certain the crown invests carefully. But yes, it's promising." She approached him, resting a hand lightly on his chest. "You know, nights like these show the realm what kind of king you are. Once upon a time, no one would believe that a feast in your hall could go by without someone losing a tongue or a limb." Her words, gently spoken, carried the memory of his darker days. He didn't look away. "I hope my earlier cruelties fade into memory someday. But I don't delude myself, there will always be those who remember." She traced her fingertips along the collar of his tunic. "People remember, yes. But memory is malleable. Each day you do right by them, you reshape what they believe is true of you. Perhaps one day they'll recall your old ways only as a tale to warn children not to be too proud." Her smile curved. "You'll become the king who rose above his own flaws." He was tempted to express gratitude for her faith in him, but he could see in her face that she already knew. Instead, he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. The scent of rose oil still clung to her hair. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of calm, a certainty that he was on the right path. The next day, letters arrived from the north carrying official seals from Winterfell. Joffrey and Margaery were in the council chamber discussing the city's grain stockpiles with Tyrion and a handful of officers when a messenger entered and handed over the sealed parchment. Joffrey broke the wax, scanning the lines with a subtle tension. Over time, his correspondence with Sansa had grown civil but never warm. There was too much history between them. Nevertheless, they maintained a practical exchange of letters discussing trade matters, occasional border skirmishes with wildlings, and other realm business. He read now that winter snows had begun in earnest in the north. A portion of the King's Road near Moat Cailin was blocked by heavy drifts, trade wagons forced to halt. Sansa requested the Crown's assistance in sending supplies by ship to White Harbor until the roads could be cleared again. Tywin might once have scoffed at such a request, but Joffrey read each line carefully, recalling how well the North had upheld their part of the new alliance. They'd sent men to reinforce the wall, they'd paid taxes on time, and they had avoided internal conflicts, uniting under Sansa's leadership. He knew that refusing to help them in their time of need would sow distrust. More importantly, he no longer saw the people of the North as an expendable resource. They were part of the realm he had pledged to protect. He glanced around the table. Tyrion waited, his head tilted, no doubt curious about the letter's contents. Margaery observed him quietly, trusting his judgment. Finally, Joffrey said, "Sansa needs supplies shipped to White Harbor. The roads are blocked. I see no reason to deny her. Let's arrange for a small fleet to carry grain and other essentials." One of the officers, a gruff man named Ser Halid, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, shipping supplies may strain our own reserves if this winter worsens. Should we not reserve as much for King's Landing first?" Tyrion tapped his fingers on the table. "We have improved our stocks significantly over the past year, thanks to the expansions in trade with the Reach. We can afford some measure of generosity, especially if we want the North to remain loyal." Margaery nodded. "If we show that we will honor their requests now, they'll remember it when we face a crisis. Unity goes both ways." Joffrey recalled how, not long ago, he might have snapped at anyone who questioned his decisions. Now he weighed Ser Halid's concerns. "How do the numbers look?" he asked Tyrion. "Are we truly able to send a substantial amount without threatening our own reserves?" Tyrion gave a slight nod. "We can. Perhaps not an extravagant shipment, but enough to see White Harbor through the worst of the road closures. We'll have to monitor our own supply, of course, but I believe it's doable." "Then let's do it," Joffrey decided. "Draft a reply to Lady Sansa, informing her that ships will depart within the fortnight, weather permitting. We'll also request that she coordinate with her men at White Harbor so the unloading goes smoothly. The faster we can move cargo, the less risk of the ships being iced in." A subtle sense of satisfaction settled in the chamber. Margaery gave him a small approving look. Tyrion scratched notes on a parchment. Ser Halid, though still concerned, bobbed his head in reluctant acceptance. By mid-morning, ravens were dispatched to Winterfell, carrying news of the Crown's support. All told, it was a routine matter of governance, but to Joffrey, it symbolized how drastically things had changed. Not so long ago, the idea of him willingly aiding Sansa Stark would have been laughable or an outright lie. Yet here he was, sending ships laden with supplies. It was not altruism alone. He wanted to keep the North's loyalty. But a portion of him also wanted to ensure that innocent families in the North did not starve. Life in the capital unfolded in a pattern of sorts. Joffrey spent much of his days in the council chamber or overseeing disputes in the throne room. Margaery devoted herself to her charitable endeavors, including expansions to the city's orphanages and medical facilities. Sometimes she traveled to the poorest districts, guarded by the King's Guard, to see firsthand what was needed. She had a knack for disarming suspicion, speaking gently with people who once would have spat at the name Lannister or Baratheon. Even if Joffrey's name still carried the echo of old terrors, Margaery's presence softened hearts and allowed them to think differently. She and her grandmother, the indomitable Olenna Tyrell, continued to strengthen the bond between House Tyrell and the throne. Olenna's sharp tongue sometimes clashed with Cersei's constant wariness, but even Cersei, in her subdued state, found it hard to dismiss the Tyrell matriarch's cunning. When not occupied with official duties, Joffrey occasionally visited the training yard to keep his swordsmanship in practice. He had been a passable fighter in his youth, though he leaned on the hound's brutality. Now he sought a surer, more disciplined technique. He had no illusions of matching the greatest knights, but a king ought to know how to defend himself. It felt better, more honest, to test himself with real effort rather than relying on scapegoating others or surrounding himself with bullies. Occasionally, Jaime Lannister would join him, offering pointers with a laconic air. Even with his missing hand, Jaime remained a formidable presence, working tirelessly to adapt his fighting style to his left hand. If the old Joffrey had sneered at weakness in others, the new Joffrey found a sort of respect for Jaime's determination. That unspoken respect lingered in their sessions, though they rarely spoke of personal matters. The wedge that had come between them over the years remained, partly because Joffrey had once refused any fatherly presence, partly because Jaime was reluctant to claim his paternal role. Still, the tension eased somewhat as time passed, turning into an unspoken truce. One chilly afternoon, Joffrey finished sparring and paused beneath the shade of an overhanging balcony to catch his breath. He wore a quilted doublet that had been lightly padded for training, sweat trailing down his temples. To his surprise, he noticed Brienne of Tarth observing from the other side of the yard. Tall and imposing, she was clad in her plain steel armor, cloak pinned at one shoulder. She was talking quietly with one of the newer knights of the King's Guard. Ever since Joffrey's transformation, Brienne's presence in King's Landing had taken on a different flavor. She had once sworn herself to serve the interests of the late Renly Baratheon, and later she had undertaken her own quests for Lady Catelyn Stark. But that was all in the past. Now she was simply a knight who had proven her honor many times over. When she noticed Joffrey looking, she offered a polite nod. He inclined his head in return. An idea occurred to him, and he stepped across the yard, boots crunching on loose gravel. The Kingsguard knight moved aside respectfully, leaving him face to face with the tall warrior woman who dwarfed him by several inches. He looked up, remembering vividly how he'd once mocked her appearance as a half-man. Shame fluttered in his gut at the memory. "Sir Brienne," he said, "I trust your duties are going well?" She regarded him seriously, clearly still unsure of this new, more courteous Joffrey. "Yes, your grace. I am assisting with training some of the younger knights. They show promise." He nodded, glancing toward the practice dummies where a few youths swung wooden swords. "Good," he said. "We need knights who can serve with integrity, especially if rumors of threats in the north prove true. Or anything else that might come from beyond the seas." She tilted her head slightly. "You speak of the Targaryen girl?" He took a slow breath, glancing around to ensure no eavesdroppers lurked too near. "Reports say she's conquered most of Slaver's Bay and has the support of those cities. Whether she sails for Westeros soon or not is anyone's guess. If she does, well, we'll need to be ready." Brienne considered that. The stories of her dragons may be exaggerated, but perhaps not. Even if they are true, we are many leagues away. As for me, I stand ready to defend the realm. Joffrey studied her face. There was no false bravado there. Brienne was earnest. He wondered if she would choose to stand for him if Daenerys Targaryen brought an army under the banner of House Targaryen. Once, the question would have grated on him and he might have demanded assurances. But now he simply said, "I appreciate your commitment. We'll do what must be done if the time comes." She inclined her head. "If I may be of further service, your grace, I am at your command." He offered a tight smile. "We'll see to it." For a moment, he contemplated asking her more about how she had once served the Starks, or Sansa in particular, but that might dredge up old wounds. He decided against it and simply excused himself politely. Walking away, he noted how natural it felt to treat even a knight he once sneered at with respect. He wasn't entirely sure when that shift had become second nature, but it was there now, guiding him. He returned to his apartments, mind already turning to the swirl of responsibilities that awaited him. Days turned into weeks. The Dornish delegates departed on favorable terms, pleased to have worked out trade expansions. Messages from Winterfell indicated that the roads remained blocked, but White Harbor had received the crown's supplies, easing the North's burdens for the moment. Margaery spent her mornings in the city's poorer districts, distributing warm cloaks and food staples as the weather cooled, while Joffrey reviewed proposals for a new canal system near the Blackwater. The monotony of governance, while less dramatic than war, was a sign that Westeros was stabilizing. One afternoon, a raven arrived bearing dark tidings. Balon Greyjoy's brother Euron had returned from his voyages across the seas, seizing the Seastone chair by force and proclaiming himself king of the Iron Islands. The missive stated that Euron's new fleet was rumored to be larger and more fearsome than before, possibly reinforced by strange cell sails from Essos. Lords in the coastal regions of the Westerlands worried about renewed raids. Ships bearing the royal banner had already intercepted a few iron-born marauders near Case. Joffrey read this news in the council chamber with a stern frown. When he looked up, he found Tyrion fidgeting with a quill, and Margaery quietly waiting for his reaction. Cersei was also present for once, sitting stiffly at the far end of the table, her golden hair braided in a crown-like coil. She regarded Joffrey with narrowed eyes, as though testing him. He wondered what she expected. Perhaps she hoped he would revert to rash violence and crush the Iron Islands, or maybe she was waiting to see if he had grown soft. He cleared his throat. We can't let the Ironborn run rampant, but we also can't overextend ourselves. We should coordinate a defensive strategy along the western coasts. If Euron tries to raid in force, we'll respond decisively. If he seeks parley, we'll entertain it, but only from a position of strength. Tyrion nodded. A wise approach. The Iron Islands have always been fractious. We can't be sure Euron's hold on his own people is secure, but we certainly shouldn't underestimate him. Cersei leaned forward slightly. Send the royal fleet. Bombard them. Teach the Ironborn another lesson, she said, her voice hard. Margaery spoke softly. Widespread bombardment would hurt many innocents on the Isle's women, children. These are not all raiders. Cersei turned a cold stare on her daughter-in-law. War is never gentle, Margaery. Perhaps you should remember that before advising the king to show mercy to a savage folk who thrive on pillage. Joffrey's jaw tightened. He recalled the old days, when he would have lapped up Cersei's approval if he displayed cruelty. But he had seen what unbridled violence brought. Chaos, hatred, and endless grudges that bled the realm. Mother, he said, his tone firm, we will first strengthen our coastal defenses, ensure that no raids succeed. If Euron decides to test us, we'll meet him at sea. But we won't simply sail around burning villages full of common folk on those islands. Cersei's lips thinned, but she did not argue further. Tyrion tapped his quill, penning a directive. Orders for the Royal Navy to patrol from Lannisport to Fair Isle, doubling watch. We might also consider enlisting some privateer captains. People like Salladhor Saan, if he's still around. He served Stannis once, but gold can sway a cell sail. Joffrey grimaced at the mention of Stannis, who still brooded on Dragonstone. Yet it was a valid point. In times of uncertain threats, forging alliances with those who understood the seas was vital. Arrange for it, he said. Offer them fair pay for honest work. And if they betray us, well, we'll deal with that swiftly. The meeting concluded with that plan in place. Cersei swept out, ignoring Margaery's polite farewell, leaving Tyrion and Joffrey to discuss the fine details of financing the expanded Navy patrols. The undercurrent of tension remained. Dealing with the Iron Islands was never simple, but Joffrey was determined to handle it as carefully as possible. Over the next few weeks, word filtered in that the royal fleet had arrived near the coasts, joined by a handful of sell-sail vessels that Tyrion had managed to lure with promises of gold. Minor skirmishes occurred, with a few Ironborn longships testing the defenses, but so far, nothing escalated into a large invasion. Euron remained elusive. Some said he was off in the Stepstones pillaging foreign ships. Others claimed he was simply biding his time. In the midst of these concerns, another raven arrived with a new set of tidings, this time from the far north. The Night's Watch had reported increased sightings of strange creatures beyond the wall, including dead men that walked under the moonlight. Joffrey read these words in silence, remembering the vague rumors that had circulated for years. He had initially dismissed talk of White Walkers as nonsense. But too many letters had arrived from the north, too many accounts from the wildlings who had fled south. Something stirred in the land of always winter. He found Margaery in the gardens, surrounded by late-blooming flowers that had been carefully bred to survive the cooler months. She was conversing with a few ladies about new seeds from the Reach, but she paused the moment she saw him approach with grim determination in his expression. The ladies took their leave, scattering politely. Joffrey held out the raven's letter, letting her scan it. When she finished, she lifted her eyes to his. "You believe them now?" He exhaled, glancing at the rose bushes. I do. I was a fool not to sooner. The wildling invasion a while back. The rumors that came with it. The sightings beyond the wall. The disappearance of so many rangers. There's too much consistency to dismiss. If the Night's Watch warns of an army of the dead, we should at least prepare for the possibility. She studied him. The realm is more united than it's been in years. Perhaps that's exactly what we need if something truly terrible comes from the far north. He nodded, setting his jaw. We need to coordinate with the Night's Watch. They lack resources. The Seven Kingdoms have neglected them for too long. Winter is here, or close enough that it makes no difference, and they're out there in black cloaks, half-starved, holding off who knows what. We can't let the wall fall. She laid a hand on his arm. You speak like a king who wants to protect more than just his own seat. That's good. For a moment, he flashed on that old part of himself, the boy who would have scoffed at the notion of saving a bunch of black-cloaked men in the freezing north. But that boy was gone. If the wall falls, or if a threat breaches it, the chaos that follows would consume us all. It's as much self-preservation as it is duty. She inclined her head. There's wisdom in that. So what do you plan to do? He drew her hand into his. I'll call a gathering of the lords again, or at least send ravens urging them to reinforce the watch with men and supplies. The watch's numbers are too small. They need swords, stone, food, clothing, everything. If this threat is real, we must not ignore it. That evening, Joffrey sent out letters to every major lord in Westeros, from Sunspear to the Eyrie, from Riverrun to Highgarden, from Storm's End to the north. He emphasized the renewed unity of the realm and the necessity of defending it from any external threat. He requested contributions in either manpower or resources to fortify the wall. He couched it in terms of duty and also offered to reciprocate. If the Iron Throne's vassals supported the Night's Watch, the crown would ensure fair tax adjustments and other benefits in return. Uncertainty rippled through the realm. Some lords thought it a waste of time and gold. Others took the threat more seriously. Over the next moon's turn, wagons loaded with black cloaks, grain, and weapons trickled up the King's Road, passing through Moat Cailin, heading for Castle Black. The flow was slow, hampered by snow, but it was more than the Watch had seen in decades. Joffrey's orders ensured the crown footed part of the expense, and Margaery convinced the Tyrells to send additional supplies. Even the Lannisters contributed under the watchful eye of Kevan Lannister, who had assumed more responsibilities since Tywin's passing. Amid these efforts, Joffrey discovered an unexpected ally, Jon Snow, who had become the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Letters bearing his seal arrived in King's Landing, filled with gratitude and warnings of what lay beyond the wall. Joffrey read them with a mixture of curiosity and relief. He had never truly known Jon Snow. Only heard rumors that he was Ned Stark's bastard stationed on the wall. Now he corresponded with him as king to commander, forging a strange alliance on paper. Jon's letters spoke of uneasy alliances with wildlings, of a greater enemy lurking. He asked for men to help man the abandoned castles along the wall. If we fail to guard every pass, the enemy will find a way through, one letter read. We fight for the living, and that includes everyone in the Seven Kingdoms, small folk, lords, and yes, kings. Winter is here, and with it comes the dead. The earnestness in those words struck Joffrey. He responded by promising more resources and encouraging the southern lords to set aside their prejudices against wildlings. Whether or not they would do so remained to be seen, but the attempt was made. All the while, King's Landing itself began to feel the shift in seasons. The wind had grown colder, the skies often leaden. On occasion, a flurry of snow would drift in from the distant north, though it rarely stuck to the ground. The city's people went about their lives uncertain of what winter would bring. The new shipments from the Reach and Dorne helped keep them fed, ensuring that the old nightmares of famine did not take hold. Joffrey continued to hold open court sessions. Each moon's turn, he invited commoners and minor lords to air their grievances. He gave judgments that sought to balance fairness with a need to maintain order. The city's confidence in him, while still tinged with caution, was far stronger than it had ever been. The impetus to remain just was tested when a highborn family from the Westerlands accused one of the city's blacksmiths of forging subpar swords and cheating them out of gold. The blacksmith, frightened and poorly spoken, insisted that the family was lying in hopes of blaming him for their own incompetent usage of the blades. The father of the family was red-faced with anger, demanding that Joffrey punish the blacksmith severely. Once, such an accusation might have led Joffrey to side with the highborn claimant without question. Now he demanded a thorough investigation. Tyrion helped procure the blacksmith's records, which showed he had purchased good steel. Margaery quietly suggested that an unbiased knight test one of the swords. The test showed the blade was of adequate quality, no masterpiece, but far from flawed. In the end, Joffrey judged in the blacksmith's favor, ordering the highborn family to compensate him for potential loss of business from their slander. The father spluttered in outrage, threatening to go to the king's mother. Joffrey stared him down, voice cutting through the hall with an edge reminiscent of the old Joffrey. "I am the king," he said. "My word is final here. If you think to circumvent me, you will find no one more powerful to hear your complaint." The father, cowed, stormed out with his brood. The blacksmith, trembling, bowed repeatedly in relief, tears in his eyes. As he left, a murmur ran through the onlookers. People remarked that once the blacksmith would have lost his head just to appease a noble's pride. That evening, Joffrey found a sort of grim satisfaction in having dispensed justice fairly. He was not naive, some would call him foolish for angering a noble house over a lowly blacksmith. But he reasoned that if word spread that even a poor craftsman could receive fair judgment from the crown, it would bolster confidence that the king was not merely a servant to the nobility's whims. It was a dangerous balancing act, but it felt right. In a quiet moment, Margaery teased him gently. "You know, if the father does complain to your mother, she might just try to stir up trouble in her own way." He exhaled, recalling Cersei's stern countenance. "Let her," he said. "I won't budge. I've already set my course, and it's the only way forward now." As the days went on, more ravens arrived bearing incremental responses from the lords. Some were enthusiastic about supporting the watch. Others grumbled at the cost but complied in part. A few balked entirely, unconvinced that the threat was real. The Boltons in the north offered only minimal assistance, suspiciously lacking in detail. Joffrey suspected Roose Bolton was reluctant to strengthen the watch because it gave fewer opportunities for him to manipulate the region. But Sansa Stark's authority had grown, and the Stark loyalists overshadowed any attempts by House Bolton to sabotage the crown's requests. Finally, the inevitable summons came. Jon Snow himself ventured south, accompanied by a small honor guard of rangers and wildlings, an unprecedented move. They traveled as far as Winterfell, where Sansa received them, and then continued onward. Word of their approach reached King's Landing. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch sought an audience with King Joffrey. It was a moment that might shape the realm's response to the looming northern threat. Some voices in the capital claimed it was folly to allow wildlings into King's Landing. Cersei called it madness. Others declared it necessary to hear them out, for the wildlings knew the horrors of the far north better than any. Joffrey made his decision with a firm resolve. He would allow Jon Snow and his retinue inside the city walls, under guard, for an official audience in the throne room. The day arrived cold and overcast, with a pale sun that fought through clouds. The gates of King's Landing opened to admit the small party from the wall. Onlookers gawked at the sight of the black-cloaked rangers riding alongside men and women in furs that marked them as free folk from beyond the wall. Their faces were hard, weathered by a life far harsher than anything in the south. They carried themselves with a defiant pride, even as they endured the stares of thousands of city dwellers. At their head rode Jon Snow, recognizable by the black cloak with white fur at the shoulders and the sword at his side. Longclaw, with its white wolf's head pommel. He was older than when Sansa had last seen him at Winterfell, more solemn, with a haunted cast to his dark eyes. As he and his party proceeded through the streets, gold cloaks kept a careful watch. There was tension in the air, curiosity, and a hint of unease. A few small folk cheered them, seeing them as heroes who had stood against wildlings in the past. Others muttered uncertainly about letting barbarians into the city. Yet no violence erupted. They arrived at the Red Keep's gates, dismounted, and were escorted through torchlit corridors into the throne room. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, robed in red velvet trimmed with gold fur, Margaery at his side in a gown of winter rose green. The highest lords of the court, including Tyrion, Jaime, Kevan Lannister, Olenna Tyrell, and a cluster of lesser courtiers, stood in attendance. Cersei observed from a vantage point behind the king's seat, her expression inscrutable. Jon Snow strode forward, the hiss of his boots on the marble floor echoing in the vast hall. His rangers and wildling companions kept pace. Joffrey noticed the glances from some courtiers, fear, distrust, and curiosity all mingled in the air. At a respectful distance, Jon knelt briefly, though it was more of a bow than a subservient prostration. "Your Grace," he said, voice steady. "I am Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. I come before you to thank you for the supplies and men you've sent to the wall, and to ask for more." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Joffrey leaned forward slightly, regarding him. Here was the bastard son of Ned Stark, once an object of scorn among some southern courtiers, now standing as leader of the Night's Watch. "Rise," Joffrey said, keeping his voice measured. We have heard troubling rumors about the state of the far north. Tell us what you've seen." Jon rose, his expression grave. "The army of the dead is real, your grace. The White Walkers command them. We have seen their numbers swelling, and every man or woman they kill joins their ranks as a white. They march slowly south, and if the wall is not properly manned, if we do not unite against them, they will breach it. Even now, they test us. Scouts have sighted movements near the Fist of the First Men and Har home. They're gathering, waiting for winter's deepest cold." Silence hung heavy in the throne room. Some courtiers seemed skeptical, but no one dared speak out yet. Joffrey thought of how many times such stories had been dismissed as children's tales. He saw no trace of deception in Jon Snow's eyes, only grim resolve. "We've begun sending you supplies," he said, choosing each word carefully. "But if your situation is truly as dire as you claim, you'll need more than food and clothes. You'll need armies. The entire realm cannot simply march north on your word, though. We've only just recovered from a war that tore the Seven Kingdoms apart." A tall, broad-shouldered man among the wildlings stepped forward, earning a flurry of nervous shifting among the gold cloaks. He had fierce blue eyes and a red beard that bristled with confidence. Jon Snow glanced at him, giving a nod as though granting permission to speak. "I'm Tormund Giantsbane," the man announced, voice booming. "I've been beyond the wall my whole life. I've fought these dead things. I've seen them tear through a wildling camp like they were children's dolls. If we don't unite, we're all dead. Your fancy swords and your fine clothes won't help you when the dead come knocking." Courtiers stirred in outrage at his bluntness, but Joffrey raised a hand to quell them. Tormund's words, though coarse, made a chill run down Joffrey's spine. "And what do you suggest?" Jon Snow answered, "We ask that the crown call the banners once again, this time not to fight each other, but to face a common enemy. We need men stationed at Eastwatch, the Shadow Tower, and every castle we can restore along the wall. We need supplies to last the winter. And if the day comes that they break through, we need the armies of the south to meet them before they flood into the Greenlands." It was an immense request, a call to rally all Seven Kingdoms to fight a threat many believed was mere myth. Joffrey felt the weight of it. He swept his gaze around the hall, noting the uncertain faces. Tyrion looked thoughtful, Margaery concerned. Cersei's lips formed a thin line, her eyes flicking from Jon to Joffrey as if searching for some sign of weakness. He said nothing for a long moment, then rose from the Iron Throne, the metal scraping lightly under his movement. He descended 2 steps, stopping near enough to see the lines of fatigue on Jon's face. "Lord Commander, you've given us much to consider. I don't doubt your sincerity, but I must hear more. I'll summon my council to meet with you. We'll have a thorough discussion of the resources required, the plans for defense, and how the wildlings fit into all this." Jon dipped his head. "Of course, your grace. I only ask that we move swiftly. The enemy won't wait." Joffrey nodded, then his voice rose enough to address the entire throne room. "The Night's Watch has defended the realm for thousands of years. We will not abandon them now. Anyone who dismisses their warnings does so at their own peril. For my part, I'll do all I can to ensure the wall holds." With that, he signaled for a herald to escort Jon Snow and his party to suitable quarters. It would take time to assemble the council. As they departed, Joffrey glanced up to see Margaery's steady gaze, full of a resolute kindness that encouraged him to stay on this path. He also saw the wariness in Cersei's expression, though she knew enough not to voice it openly before the entire court. The atmosphere in the hall was thick with the awareness that something unprecedented had just occurred. The king had acknowledged a looming threat that demanded unity across all lines, southern, northern, wildling. When the hall began to clear, Joffrey ascended to the dais again, sitting heavily on the Iron Throne. He felt the prickle of the metal against his back, a reminder of how precarious power could be. War or not, the seat was never truly comfortable. For a moment, the weight of the realm and the approaching winter pressed on him. Then Margaery approached, resting a hand lightly on his arm, offering silent support. In the days that followed, the small council met with Jon Snow, Tormund Giantsbane, and a handful of the other rangers. They pored over rough maps of the territory beyond the wall, discussing the best places to build watchtowers, how to reinforce crumbling castles, and the logistics of sending men north. The greatest challenge was that the realm's lords had grown weary of war. Many would demand to see real proof of the undead threat before risking more soldiers. Others were too entangled in local disputes to care about distant nightmares. Yet Joffrey was determined that the crown must lead by example. Cersei attended the first of these council meetings, her eyes narrowed as Tormund spoke of ice spiders and armies of corpses. She appeared unconvinced. When pressed for her opinion, she merely said, "I will defer to the king's judgment." Joffrey recognized that her acquiescence might be temporary. He made a mental note to watch her carefully. Tyrion, for his part, took a pragmatic view. "I've made arrangements for the crown to purchase additional dragonglass from Dragonstone," he said during one meeting, referencing the obsidian that was rumored to be effective against White Walkers. "Stannis once gathered a store of it, and there are natural deposits in the island's hills. If we can pay a fair price, or at least negotiate a truce with Stannis for that resource, we might get what we need." Jon Snow nodded. "Obsidian can kill White Walkers, or so we've discovered. Steel alone, even Valyrian steel, is rare enough. We'll need as many arrows and blades of dragonglass as we can craft." At that, Joffrey remembered the centuries-old knowledge. His world had been so consumed by the politics of the living that the idea of forging weapons to fight the dead felt surreal. But times were changing, and if there was even a chance these stories were true, it was worth it. "Do it," he told Tyrion. "Send word to Stannis. If he's wise, he'll see that granting us the dragonglass is in his interest as well. If not, we'll find another way." The negotiations proceeded. Letters flew across the realm. The Stannis situation was delicate. He still claimed to be the rightful king, but his power had dwindled to near irrelevance. Yet he clung to Dragonstone with a smoldering determination. The idea of parleying with him would have been unthinkable a year ago, but the prospect of White Walkers forced a re-examination of old grudges. To Joffrey's cautious relief, Stannis' first response did not outright refuse. Instead, the dour man demanded to meet with a crown emissary. Tyrion volunteered to go, perhaps half for the adventure, half for the chance to witness Stannis' gloom in person. Joffrey agreed on the condition that Tyrion travel with a suitable escort. Before Tyrion departed, Joffrey spoke to him in private. "Be careful. Stannis might decide to kill you on principle." Tyrion smirked. "He might, but I've found that men like Stannis respond to reason if you present it properly, and throw in some measure of moral righteousness. He likes to see himself as an unyielding champion of truth. If we spin the White Walker threat correctly, he might set aside his hatred of me long enough to help." That day, Tyrion rode out of King's Landing at the head of a small contingent. Joffrey watched from the battlements, Margaery at his side, recalling the many times in the past he had mocked or dismissed Tyrion. Now, he was entrusting him with a mission that could shape the realm's defense. It was a testament to how much had changed. Meanwhile, Jon Snow and his wildling companions spent their days within the city, meeting with various officials, demonstrating the truth of their claims through stories and, occasionally, old scars. They caused a bit of a stir among the small folk, who had rarely seen wildlings in the city, but no major incidents occurred. At times, Joffrey met privately with Jon to discuss further details. Despite the tension that lingered from the days when Joffrey had tormented Sansa, they found common ground in their desire to protect Westeros from the undead threat. They spoke little of personal matters, each man's pride preventing too close a friendship, but they treated each other with a respectful courtesy that astonished those who remembered Joffrey's old cruelty. Outside the city walls, winter's slow advance continued. Reports came of heavier snows in the Riverlands, a poor harvest in some parts of the Reach, storms hitting the narrow sea. Yet King's Landing, with its southern location and the new stability, endured. Gold cloaks distributed firewood at controlled prices, ensuring fewer froze in the streets. Margaery's orphanages expanded further, providing shelter for displaced families. The realm was not without hardship, but it was not descending into chaos as it had during Joffrey's early reign. When at last Tyrion returned from Dragonstone, he brought surprising news. Stannis had agreed to sell the crown a portion of the Dragonglass stores in exchange for a series of concessions regarding the Stormlands. The meeting had been tense, but Tyrion's persuasive arguments and the looming threat from beyond the wall had apparently swayed Stannis' rigid sense of duty. An official envoy from Dragonstone would soon deliver the precious cargo to King's Landing, where blacksmiths could begin crafting arrowheads, spear tips, and knives. It was a bizarre alliance, bridging rivals who had once tried to kill each other in open battle. But as Tyrion cynically put it, the best alliances are born of necessity, not trust. With that development, Joffrey felt a surge of determination. The realm was uniting under the specter of a threat no one had believed in just a few years before. He ordered the forges to be prepared, summoning skilled smiths from across the city. Even Gendry, the bastard boy of Robert Baratheon, once working in the city's forges, was rumored to have a talent for metalwork. Though Joffrey's old self might have scorned the idea of acknowledging another of Robert's bastards, the new Joffrey recognized that skill mattered more than birth. Efforts were made to bring the best smiths together to produce weapons that might, if the stories held true, save thousands of lives. Word spread of the crown's preparations, and across Westeros, lords grew uneasy. Some ridiculed Joffrey's efforts as foolhardy, suggesting that the king had been tricked by northern superstition. Others saw the movement of resources and wondered if another war was coming, perhaps against the Targaryen girl rumored to be in Essos. But the shipments of grain and men to the wall continued, guided by Jon Snow's directions, and the Watchers in Black gradually formed a stronger, more diverse defensive line. This uneasy truce spanned wildlings, Northmen, and Southern Knights. 1,000 small steps formed the beginnings of a realm that might stand together when true horror descended. Then, on a bitterly cold morning, a raven arrived from the north. Jon Snow received it first, pale-faced, and immediately requested an audience with Joffrey. They met in the king's solar, an intimate gathering with Margaery, Tyrion, and a few key advisors. Jon handed the letter over without a word. Joffrey read the scrawled lines, feeling the chill sink into his bones. Reports from the far side of the wall indicated a large host of whites moving toward Eastwatch. The ranger who'd sent the message claimed they had days, maybe a fortnight, before the undead crashed against the wall in force. If they breach Eastwatch, they can skirt along the coast, Jon said. We'll do our best to hold, but we're outnumbered. We need reinforcements now. Joffrey's heart hammered. This was the moment everything they had prepared for might be put to the test. How many men do you need? Jon's eyes flicked to Tyrion, then back to Joffrey. As many as you can spare. The lords of the north will send what they have, but winter slows everything. We can't wait weeks for them to gather. Margaery spoke softly. You want the king to send part of the royal army. Right now. Jon nodded. Yes. Even a few thousand men, if well led, might tip the balance. The wildlings know the land can guide them to Eastwatch quickly enough. Time is everything. Tyrion tapped his fingers against his chair. It's a big decision, Your Grace. Sending a large portion of the royal army north during winter, the Ironborn might see an opportunity to raid. Dornish tensions could flare. The Targaryen threat still looms. Are we prepared for that risk? Joffrey stared at the letter in his hand. He thought of the long arc that had brought him here, from sadistic boy king to a ruler who tried to unite his people. If he hesitated now, if he did nothing in the face of this monstrous enemy, would everything he'd built come crashing down? He thought of Margaery's unwavering faith, Tyrion's cunning, the loyalty he had painstakingly nurtured, the orphans in the city who looked to him as a protector, and the men of the Night's Watch who relied on him to keep his word. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. We send them, he said, voice quiet but firm. I'll issue commands to form an army contingent, 2,000-3,000 men if we can. We'll provision them with whatever supplies they need for the cold. Jon, you'll guide them north. Our men can follow your lead, but I'll appoint a royal commander to coordinate. And they must move quickly. In the meantime, we keep the city defended and we keep an eye on the coasts. I won't let the realm fall into chaos behind our backs. But if we do nothing, we'll be inviting a worse fate. Jon Snow nodded, relief mingling with the gravity in his eyes. Thank you, Your Grace. The Watch won't forget this. Thus began a flurry of preparations. Ravens flew to muster a portion of the royal forces, many of whom were stationed in the Crownlands and the Reach. Loras Tyrell, serving as one of the more capable knights, was assigned to lead them alongside a cadre of loyal commanders. Joffrey ordered that wagons full of winter gear and supplies accompany them, courtesy of the Tyrells' well-stocked resources. The city's blacksmiths worked day and night to shape the newly arrived dragaglass into arrowheads, spear tips, and short blades. Some would stay in King's Landing for further forging, but many were rushed north in the first convoys. As the time came for the royal contingent to depart, Joffrey stood in the courtyard, watching the men form ranks. Their breath frosted in the air, and each soldier wore heavier cloaks than usual. Standard-bearers held up the crowned stag of Baratheon alongside the golden rose of Tyrell, symbolizing a joint effort. The Lannister lion was present as well, though less prominently. Tyrion oversaw the logistics, ensuring the wagons were loaded properly. Margaery moved among the ranks, speaking words of encouragement, reminding the men how vital their mission was. Jon Snow and Tormund Giantsbane conferred with Loras Tyrell, planning the route. Cersei lingered on a balcony, watching with an unreadable expression. Joffrey could feel her disapproval, but she said nothing to stop him. Her brand of power had waned as the realm coalesced around Joffrey's leadership and Margaery's diplomacy. Perhaps she sensed that trying to undermine him now would do more harm to her own standing than good. Before the army marched out, Joffrey approached Jon Snow. They met near a wagon heaped with dragonglass. A hush fell around them, the rangers stepping aside. "Lord Commander," Joffrey said, "I leave these men in your care. Ser Loras will represent the crown's command, but you and your watchers know this enemy best. Guide them well." Jon nodded. "I will. Thank you for trusting me and for trusting Tormund and his people. It's more than many southern kings would do." Joffrey inclined his head. "A king protects all his subjects, even those who once lived beyond the wall. Good fortune to you. I'll hold the realm together here in the meantime." Jon hesitated a moment. Then, in a gesture of respect, he clasped Joffrey's forearm. It was not the full formality of a knight's vow, but a strong mutual acknowledgement. Joffrey returned the clasp. There was no warmth in the cold air, but in that moment a sense of unity bound them, a once cruel boy king and a bastard of House Stark, neither of whom would ever have predicted they might share the same cause. Moments later, Jon mounted a sturdy horse, Tormund at his side, and signaled the column to move out. Hundreds of hooves clattered on the cobblestones, wagons groaned under their loads, and the gates of King's Landing creaked open. The army began its long trek north under a gray sky. Joffrey watched them vanish into the distance, a swell of conflicting emotions in his chest, worry, hope, and a surprising sense of pride that he was finally acting like the King Westeros might need. In the weeks that followed, the city braced itself. News traveled slowly in winter. Whispers of fear circulated among the small folk, talk of ice demons, walking corpses, and endless winter. Joffrey took care to maintain calm, issuing statements that the king's men were on the wall to ensure the safety of all. He recognized the delicate balance between warning the people and not inciting panic. With Margaery's help, he organized small gatherings where septons and septas preached unity and faith in the Seven to protect them in dark times. The orphanages remained well-stocked, the city guard remained vigilant, and commerce continued, albeit at a somewhat reduced pace due to the chill. Days stretched on, each one colder than the last, with no word from the north. Cersei avoided direct confrontation with Joffrey, though she sometimes passed him in the halls with a click of her tongue, as if to say, "You'll regret this." He brushed it off, focusing on the city's well-being. Tyrion pored over logistics, ensuring that the realm did not plunge into debt to finance the war effort. Olenna Tyrell prodded some of the more reluctant Reach lords to keep the supply lines flowing. Even Kevan Lannister pitched in, using his influence with the Westerlands to maintain a defensive posture along the coasts in case the Ironborn seized an opening. Finally, after nearly a moon's turn of silence, word arrived from Eastwatch. A raven, exhausted and half-frozen, bore a short, urgent message. The undead host had reached the wall, and a great battle was underway. The men were holding, but they faced incredible odds. Joffrey read the letter with white-knuckled tension in his solar, Margaery at his side. Tyrion, pacing behind him, asked what it said. "They're holding for now," Joffrey managed. Ser Loras, Jon Snow, and Tormund lead a combined force at Eastwatch. The wildlings used the rocky terrain near the coast to channel the whites into kill zones. They have obsidian arrows. The wall stands, but they need more men, and soon. Tyrion frowned. "We've sent nearly all we can spare without leaving the capital exposed. Unless we conscript more from the Riverlands or the Stormlands, we might not muster another large force in time. And that's if the lords cooperate." Joffrey's mind raced. The precarious peace he'd forged could unravel if he pushed the lords too far. Yet if the wall fell, the realm would face a nightmare beyond imagining. He glanced at Margaery, who watched him with a steady calm, waiting for his decision. Slowly, he said, "Draft letters to every lord. Tell them the battle has begun. If they can send men north, now is the time. I'll lead them myself if I must." Margaery's eyes widened a fraction. "You mean to go north in person?" He straightened, remembering how he had traveled to Winterfell once before to meet Sansa. "If this is truly the battle for the living, I can't just sit idle on my throne. A king who sends his men to die while he cowers behind walls is no king at all." The old Joffrey might have delighted in the idea of war, but the new Joffrey understood the stakes. He was frightened, but he refused to shirk responsibility. Tyrion's mouth twisted in a grimace. "If you die up there, the realm loses its stabilizing force. Are you sure this is wise?" Joffrey met his uncle's gaze. "I am no longer a boy. My place is where the realm's fate is decided." I'll ask you to remain here to keep King's Landing from descending into chaos in my absence." Tyrion let out a long breath. "Very well. But at least travel with a solid retinue of Kingsguard and knights you trust." Margaery stepped closer to Joffrey. "If you go, I want to come with you." He shook his head immediately. "No. Your role here is too important. The people look to you. He paused, swallowing. "If I don't return, the realm will need your guidance more than ever." She set her jaw, tears threatening to glisten in her eyes, but she nodded. "Then promise me you'll be careful." He offered a faint, sad smile. "I promise." That week was a whirlwind of preparation. Joffrey rallied knights from the Crownlands, urging them to follow him north. A portion of the city watch would remain to protect King's Landing. Tyrion and Kevan Lannister would manage the political affairs, aided by Margaery and Olenna Tyrell. Ships in the Blackwater Bay were ready to sail north to White Harbor, hoping to ferry men and supplies faster than the roads might allow, though the seas were rough in winter. When the day of departure came, Joffrey donned practical battle armor, steel plates etched with a stag and lion motif, thick furs around his shoulders to keep out the chill. He said his farewells to Margaery in the Red Keep's courtyard, the wind tugging at her hair as she clung to him for a final moment. He whispered quiet assurances, though fear roiled in his gut. Then he mounted his warhorse, flanked by the Kingsguard in white cloaks. A modest host of knights in Lannister red and Baratheon gold waited, along with a banner or two from lesser Crownland houses that had answered the call. The gates opened and they rode out of King's Landing. Citizens watched from windows and rooftops, some cheering, some silent with worry. Bells tolled softly. It felt like the beginning of a great exodus as the king himself left to face an enemy that defied all comprehension. Joffrey maintained a resolute expression, refusing to let doubt show. He led the column toward the King's Road, the sky a bleak canvas overhead. The journey north was grueling. Snow drifted more heavily with each league they passed, and the men's cloaks bore frosty edges by nightfall. They slept in hastily pitched tents or accepted the hospitality of lords who opened their keeps to them. Some joined the march, bolstering the numbers, though not as many as Joffrey would have hoped. The fear of the unknown threat kept them moving even when the cold bit their bones. Joffrey found a grim determination in himself, a willingness to endure hardships he would have once avoided at all costs. Nights were a torment of half-sleep as the wind howled outside and the ground was so cold it felt like sleeping on ice. But he pressed on, remembering the vow he had made to protect the realm. Weeks later, the king's party neared the neck, passing Moat Caelin's swampy terrain turned partially frozen. There news awaited them. Scouts from Winterfell reported that Eastwatch still held, but the undead battered the walls day and night. Banners from the Vale had arrived to reinforce the watch, thanks to a timely intervention by the Lord's Declarant, who had apparently decided to set aside the Aerys isolationist stance. Sansa Stark had sent a portion of the northern levies to the coast as well. The combined might was formidable, but so was the enemy. Joffrey led his men ever onward, teeth chattering in the biting cold. He wore heavier furs now, nearly unrecognizable as the once luxurious prince. The traveling was slow. Horses slipped on icy roads, wagons got stuck in snowdrifts, and morale began to crack. But Joffrey kept order, reminding them that they marched for the living. Captains under him repeated the phrase until it became a grim motto. When they finally reached Winterfell, its gates swung open to admit them. The courtyard, once battered by war, had been restored under Sansa's rule. She stood by the main doors, flanked by northern lords, watching as Joffrey and his knights entered. They dismounted stiffly, breath steaming, horses stamping. Joffrey approached Sansa in the swirling snow. He saw the tension in her eyes, the memory of all his cruelty. But she inclined her head, a courtesy he never thought to receive from her again. "Your Grace," she said, "Winterfell stands ready to assist your men in any way we can. There's food and lodging, though our stores are limited. We'll also show you the fastest route to Eastwatch." He nodded, voice hoarse from the cold. "Thank you, Lady Sansa. We won't linger long. My men are needed at the wall." She studied him for a moment. "Jon's letters say the battle is dire. You've come a long way. I never expected to see you here, leading men to fight for the north." He stared at the snow-covered courtyard. "Times change. People change." She accepted that with a slight nod, gesturing for him to step inside. Fires blazed in Winterfell's great hall, the warmth almost overwhelming after the bitter journey. His men gratefully removed their gloves, crowding near the hearths. Sansa arranged a modest feast, providing hot soup, bread, and roast venison. That evening, Joffrey conferred with Sansa and her lords about the best path to Eastwatch. They decided the king's party would head for the road that forked northeast, passing near the Dreadfort region, carefully avoiding Bolton lands when possible. The men would push hard with minimal stops to reinforce Eastwatch before the undead found a way around the wall's defenses. Early the next morning, Joffrey gave orders to break camp. Some men wanted to stay longer in the warmth of Winterfell, but he insisted they move on. Sansa offered a small contingent of northern riders to guide them. He thanked her and marched out again, forging deeper into the north than he had ever gone. The land grew wilder, the snow deeper, until each step was a battle in itself. Worries about the Iron Islands or the Targaryen threat seemed distant, overshadowed by the immediate struggle against winter's cruel grip. After many days, they reached the outskirts of Eastwatch by the sea. The sight that greeted them was ominous, the massive wall of ice towering into the sky, battered by howling winds off the shivering sea. Even in the pale daylight, Joffrey could see flickers of movement atop the walls, dark shapes that might be men or might be something else. Fires burned along the ramparts and the gates had been reinforced with spiked barricades. Jon Snow met them beyond the outworks, clad in black furs, face drawn with exhaustion. His relief was palpable as he saw the royal banners. He clasped Joffrey's arm again, leading him quickly through the fort's battered gate. "The Whites come every night," Jon said, voice clipped by fatigue. "We've managed to hold them off with dragonglass arrows, but they keep probing for weaknesses. A day ago, they nearly overran the western flank. Tormund lost a score of men beating them back. Loras Tyrell is in the infirmary with a wound, but it seems not mortal." Joffrey felt a stab of concern. Ser Loras was not only Margaery's brother, but also one of the most capable knights in the realm. "I need to see him. Then I'll deploy my men where they're needed most." They moved through the cramped passages of Eastwatch, stepping over scattered debris from repeated assaults. The place reeked of burnt flesh and old blood. Men hunched around fires, pale-faced, some missing limbs, others spattered with gore. Joffrey's arrival with fresh troops brought a wave of hope that flickered in their eyes. He did his best to reassure them with a nod or a word of encouragement as he passed. They found Loras in a makeshift infirmary. His armor had been removed, revealing a bandaged gash across his ribs. The knight's face was pale but set in stoic determination. He managed a weak smile when he saw Joffrey. "I told your men to hold the line, and we did just barely," he said. "Your Grace, it's worse than we imagined." Joffrey kneeled beside him. "Rest. I've brought reinforcements. We'll see this through." Loras nodded, and Jon guided Joffrey away, letting the healers do their work. They climbed to the ramparts where Tormund joined them, pointing out across the snowy wastes. Even in daylight, the land beyond the wall was bleak and lifeless. Joffrey tried to imagine an army of the dead massed somewhere out there, just beyond the horizon, waiting for darkness. His stomach twisted. Jon explained the defensive measures. They used small ballistae to fire dragonglass-tipped bolts, covered the approaches with pits lined with sharp stakes, and kept watch day and night for any sign of movement. The nightly attacks were so far only probing strikes, but each time the Whites retreated before dawn. The White Walkers themselves were glimpsed rarely, commanding from a distance. The defenders dreaded the moment they might launch a full-scale assault. Joffrey's knights began reinforcing the ramparts and gates, forming a second line behind the battered watchers. The additional men were a welcome sight to the exhausted defenders. Yet a sense of grim inevitability hung over them all. It was only a matter of time before the dead came in force. That night, Joffrey barely slept. He stood watch alongside the men, patrolling the wall walks in the freezing wind, a heavy cloak pulled tight. Hours dragged on. At times, ghostly howls sounded from the darkness, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. An hour before dawn, they attacked. The alarm came in the form of a horn blast from the sentries. Joffrey, half dozing against a wall, jolted awake, grabbing his sword. Jon Snow emerged from the gloom, shouting orders. Tormund bellowed for the wildlings to man the western flank. The Watchers scrambled to their positions, hastily knocking dragonglass arrows. Joffrey rushed to the ramparts, heart hammering. He peered over the edge and felt a surge of horror. The plain below teemed with silhouettes in the moonlight, hundreds, maybe thousands, of Whites shambling forward, eyes glowing with eerie blue light. Their jaws gnashed soundlessly. Some were fresh corpses, others mere skeletons wrapped in ice-crusted rags. Their numbers seemed unending, a tide of death. Among them stood taller figures on undead horses, White Walkers, each carrying an ice spear that glimmered in the moonlight. "Loose arrows!" Jon's voice rang out. A volley of dragonglass-tipped shafts whistled through the air, striking the front ranks. Many Whites dropped instantly, bones collapsing. Some White Walkers retreated from the arrow fire or deflected it with unnatural speed. Still, the onslaught barely dented the mass. The undead pressed forward. Joffrey found a place among the archers, ignoring the terror that clutched his gut. He fired arrows, forcing himself to breathe steadily. Each shot that found a white sent it crumpling, but for every one that fell, a dozen more advanced. A battering ram of sorts, a massive log likely dragged from the forests, slammed into the outer barricade. The walls rattled. Men shouted and hacked down whites that tried to climb. The air filled with stench of decay and the unearthly moan of the dead. Dawn was an hour away. The defenders had to hold until the first rays of sunlight, though sunlight alone did not kill these creatures. It only seemed to drive them into retreat, for reasons none could fully explain. Joffrey's arm ached from loosing arrow after arrow. He felt the old panic rising, but he clenched his teeth, refusing to let it control him. Around him, his knights fought valiantly, aided by watchmen, wildlings, and the battered men of the northern levies. They formed a living bulwark at the top of the walls, wielding dragonglass spears in close quarters. Suddenly, a shriek cut through the chaos. A white walker had leapt onto the ramparts, moving with chilling grace. Its pale skin reflected the moonlight, and its icy blades sliced through two defenders before they could react. Joffrey stared, frozen by the creature's inhuman eyes. Jon Snow charged it from the side, swinging Longclaw. The White Walker parried with an eerie clang, ice meeting Valyrian steel. Sparks danced. Before Joffrey could even think, the White Walker pivoted and slashed at Jon's flank. Jon barely dodged. Joffrey felt a surge of reckless courage. He dropped his bow, seized the nearest dragonglass-tipped spear, and lunged. His blow caught the walker's arm, not enough to destroy it, but enough to make it real. The creature spun to face him, its mouth twisting in silent rage. For a heartbeat, Joffrey met its glowing stare. Fear clawed at him, but he refused to yield. He thrust again. The walker blocked with its ice blade, the impact jarring Joffrey's arms. He stumbled. Jon took advantage, slashing diagonally with Longclaw. The Valyrian steel cut through the walker's torso. A sound like cracking ice filled the air, and the creature shattered into 1,000 crystalline shards, drifting away on the wind. Joffrey gasped, stepping back, heart pounding. He'd just fought a White Walker. The magnitude of it slammed into him. Jon offered a tense nod of thanks before rushing off to aid others, leaving Joffrey to catch his breath. The night wore on in a blur of terror and desperate fighting. At times, the Whites nearly breached the parapets, but the defenders pushed them back, though at great cost. Bodies piled up, many wounded. Horses screamed below. The repeated blasts of the horn signaled more waves of the undead. Finally, mercifully, the sky began to lighten, the faintest wash of gray giving way to pale dawn. The undead horde recoiled, as if some invisible command tugged them away. The White Walkers whistled an unearthly note, and the mass of whites began to stagger backward, dissolving into the fog. When the sun finally rose, Eastwatch was a charnel house. Hundreds lay dead or wounded. The stench of gore hung heavy in the cold air. Joffrey staggered along the ramparts, checking on survivors. His own body ached with bruises, scrapes, and exhaustion. His armor was dented in places, splattered with dark ichor. He found Tormund, who had a bleeding cut on his forehead but was otherwise alive, barking orders for men to clear the bodies. Jon approached, breath steaming in the frigid air, caked in blood and sweat. "We held," Jon said. "Barely." Joffrey nodded, an unsteady exhalation leaving him. "We'll need more men if this continues. They won't stop." Jon's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "We'll keep fighting. That's all we can do." In that moment, Joffrey realized that the war for the living would not be decided in a single night or a single battle. It might stretch on as winter deepened, exacting a terrible price from the realm. Yet he felt a fierce resolve igniting inside him. If he had once reveled in cruelty to gain fear and power, now he wielded justice and bravery to protect his people. The cost would be high, but he would pay it, if it meant saving Westeros from the darkness creeping south. In the days that followed, Eastwatch endured more attacks, each one testing the limits of the defenders. Reinforcements trickled in from the north, from the Vale, from some crownland houses that had sent additional men. The Tyrell supply lines ensured the Watchers had food, clothing, and dragonglass weaponry. Joffrey stood alongside Jon Snow, Tormund, and the battered knights day after day, night after night, driving back each wave. Sometimes the sun rose on a field of ice-strewn corpses. Sometimes they felt near collapse, but they persevered. Word spread through the Watch of how King Joffrey had personally fought a White Walker. Soldiers whispered in awe, for few southern kings had ever faced such a foe. Rumors reached King's Landing that the king fought valiantly for the realm, that he risked his life nightly on the walls. Margaery heard these tales with a mix of pride and fear. The small folk prayed for the king's safe return. Even Cersei seemed taken aback, uncertain how to react to a son who was forging his legacy in a way she never anticipated. At last, a great storm descended on the coast, swirling snow in such a blinding fury that neither side could mount a proper assault. Days of relative quiet settled. The Watchers used this respite to bury the dead, tend to the wounded, and strengthen the defenses. In the flickering torchlight of Eastwatch's cramped halls, Joffrey found a moment of reflection. He had come so far from the cruel boy who once toyed with lives for sport. Now he felt that every drop of blood spilled weighed on his conscience. Yet in that burden, he discovered a purpose more profound than any he had known. To stand as a shield against the dark, to fight for something greater than himself. As the storm raged outside, he penned a letter to Margaery, describing the battles, the losses, and the fleeting victories. He signed it simply, "Your husband who fights for the living." When the ravens could fly again, he would send it south, hoping she would know he remained steadfast. No one could say how long this war against the dead would last, or whether Daenerys Targaryen would soon land on Westeros's shores, or if Euron Greyjoy would strike the unguarded coasts. The realm was as fragile as ever, perched on the edge of an abyss. And yet, in the midst of that peril, a new legend was being forged, that of a king who had once been feared for his cruelty, who now led armies against an enemy more fearsome than any mortal foe, who fought side by side with bastards, wildlings, and knights alike in the frozen waste. Tales spread that King Joffrey Baratheon had found a higher calling than mere tyranny. He had become a guardian of the realm. Whether Westeros would survive the winter, no one could say. But if it did, historians would one day write of how the king's transformation from monster to champion played a vital role in saving the living from the tide of death. And perhaps children would grow up hearing songs not of Joffrey's vicious past, but of the day he and his allies held the wall against an enemy out of nightmares. In that uncertain dawn, as ice and fire clashed, King Joffrey's reign, tempered by Margaery's wisdom, strengthened by alliances once unimaginable, stood as a shield for Westeros. And so he continued, fighting night after night, day after day, with an unshakable resolve that would echo through time as the greatest testament to the power of change and the resilience of hope.